The funeral of Mrs. Edith Pargeter progressed with a restraint that would have flattered her, though she would have cited the absence of sandwiches as a blemish. Brayne's mourners, being people who understood the precise measurements of grief, kept their voices at the level of a discreet cough. The nave exhaled its usual Sunday cold, well aired by generations of penitents, and the lilies went about their business without demanding attention. At the front, the coffin's satin looked like the sort of luxury Edith had distrusted in life and arranged for without comment in death. The choir, agile in volume if not in intonation, ventured a hymn whose enthusiasm exceeded its pitch. Inspector Purbright, not so much attending as tolerating, selected a pew that permitted inconspicuous observation. He was accompanied, not officially, merely inevitably, by Sergeant Love, who had learned to fold his large frame into pews with a grace that suggested prior instruction from vicars or headmasters. Purbright contemplated the vicar's homily, which had the measured sympathy of a man who felt strongly that heaven was both nearer and more affordable when described in prose. The inspector found himself, as he often did in churches, listening for things not said. The unsaid had a way of taking up space. When the final amen was safely corralled, the verger advanced to adjust a crease that nobody could have seen from any distance not occupied by God. He was a careful man, the verger, with a face flattened by decades of solemn nodding. He made the small movements that churches require, a lift, a tuck, and then, as if uncovering a stowaway beneath a table napkin, he drew out an envelope. It lay on his palm like an accusation taking a rest. He did not hold it up. The verger knew about optics. He allowed his hands to descend and, with a second movement that was both accidental and choreographed, transferred it into the custody of the vicar. The exchange was so modestly done that only those who were habitually alert, the way policemen and undertakers are seen to notice. Of those, Purbright was the only one presently in a position to ask impertinent questions and have them taken humbly. The procession towards the churchyard was begun and executed with decorum. Brayne preferred clean endings and had long practice in attending them. At the graveside, where propriety and clay fraternized, the vicar spoke of Edith's thrift and reliability in terms carefully short of canonization. Love, who had known Edith only as a person who paid licenses on time and wrote letters objecting to fireworks at unseasonable hours, accepted that thrift could be a virtue that outlived its practitioner. After the first clods of earth had been applied and the last consolatory phrases exchanged with their intended retail customers, a small knot of those who run Brayne without any particular fuss drew itself towards the porch. Committees are born this way, as if extracted from stone by whether Alderman Bligh, whose chest formed a modest frontage for civic pride, joined the vicar, who had just re-entered possession of his pastoral smile. Miss Hask, editor of the parish newsletter and gatekeeper of what could be said in Brayne without being overheard, arrived with a pencil she had no intention of using. Mr. Thrip, who sold hardware with the air of dispensing remedies, stood a little back in case tools were required. Mrs. Boswell, the organist, came late, cradling a roll of music like an infant of uncertain temperament. The verger, accomplishing the rare feat of making himself both central and invisible, stood among them with the envelope. It was unstamped and unsealed, which conveyed either innocence or economy. Purbright drew near with an ease that looked accidental, and was not. "Something displaced, Mr. Delves?" he asked the verger, who bore the name without either pride or resentment. "Just put by an error, sir," Delves replied, "as can happen when folks are upset. Satin's slippy." The vicar, having fortunately cultivated a manner in which embarrassment and benevolence were indistinguishable, took over. "Inspector, perhaps you would— well, my dear Edith would have preferred we prevented any—" He settled for offering the envelope with 2 fingers and an expression of spiritual neutrality. Purbright examined the paper. It had the creamy weight of stationery bought for making points. He sniffed discreetly. There was a faint odour of furniture polish, irreligious but respectable. He noticed, too, a slight crease as if the envelope had been tested against the dimensions of a pocket and found uncooperative. "If you'll allow me," he said, and opened it. He had expected handwriting. Brayne loved penmanship the way the elderly love grandchildren at the distance of photographs. Instead, the letters marched out in the blank authority of a typewriter. He read aloud, for the benefit of those who would hear the words in any case when they were repeated in kitchens. "Reopen the subscription fund." It was not the sort of message one generally wrote to the dead, though there was a kind of appropriateness in addressing financial counsel to a woman who had treated arithmetic as a moral sense. The company in the porch adopted the wholly natural attitude of people confronted with a sentence containing a verb they had once hoped to forget. Mrs. Boswell's lips tightened as if a hymn had entered the room improperly dressed. Thrip coughed. "The subscription fund," said Alderman Bligh smoothly, "to which I gave my full support until differences of opinion and the lamentable intervention of woodworm hysteria made my continuance, unhelpful to progress." Miss Hask, who understood adjectives for what they were, recorded none of this. "We've had, as it happens," the vicar began with a swallow, "a spate of anonymous notes, friendly in intention, if perhaps somewhat conscientious," Miss Hask supplied. "One might call them conscientious." "Indeed," said the vicar, "very conscientious." Purbright resealed nothing and pocketed the note. "It may be," he said, "that Miss Pargeter wished to express a last opinion. Alternatively, someone thought she might have done so and took practical steps on her behalf." A faint snowfall of contradictory nods met this. Love, whose experience of Brayne's moral weather had taught him the value of standing under an awning, kept his face in order. "Would there be," Purbright continued, "any public record of the fund's existence? A newsletter item? Minutes? People so seldom commit improprieties without also committing them to paper." Miss Hask, who favoured filing systems in which indignation could be retrieved alphabetically, lifted her pencil as if it now had work to do. "The Brayne Parish newsletter is complete and bound, Inspector. We keep a full run. There was a front-page appeal, well, near the top, 5 years past. A handsome call for contributions. The withdrawal was notified too, though not, I confess, with prominence." "Perhaps I might consult the volumes," Purbright said, "at your convenience." "I suppose," Miss Hask replied with the generosity of someone who had already decided when he might. "Tomorrow at 10 would be tolerable. We have an erratum to set right about the vicar's reference to Saint Mark when he meant St. Luke." "That was a slip," murmured the vicar, who wore his slips as hair shirts. The little parliament in the porch gave signs of breaking up. This is to say, they lingered. Resolutions in Brayne prefer to be taken later, when recollection can be polished and second thoughts made to look like first principles. Alderman Bligh advanced a hand the size and consistency of a favoured cushion. "The town," he said, "mustn't be unsettled by old matters. Edith understood that discord and repair are both expensive. We shall do what is appropriate and in the proper places." "Cemeteries," said Mrs. Boswell, who suspected religion of preferring flowers to truth, "are proper places." "Quite," said Purbright, and smiled at no one. He and Love walked down the path between graves that had memorized Brayne's past quarrels more faithfully than any diary. The inspector did not hurry. He found that haste often frightened small facts into hedges. Love ventured onto the topic of furniture polish with the caution of a man stepping onto ice. "Bit of a scent to it, sir. Not the sort of thing one picks up from hymnals." "No," Purbright said, "nor from pockets ordinarily occupied by hands. The Polish one uses in the vestry cupboards has a citrus note. I recall it from an unfortunate morning with spiders. This is duller, like what respectable people apply when respectability is to be displayed." "Undertakers?" Love suggested. "Or someone make a show of clearing out drawers?" "The latter seems plausible," Purbright said. "A person who thinks an envelope should look like rectitude." They paused by the lich gate, which had been painted a decade ago and never quite forgiven. A small notice remained, sun-bleached to near invisibility, requesting that cyclists dismount out of consideration for the departed and the paving. Purbright touched the gate idly. The iron was cold and faintly gritty, as if cleaning had been attempted and then sensibly abandoned. On the notice board beside it, behind glass that misted at the corners like an elderly eye, were 2 parish newsletters pinned at jaunty angles. The latest announced a forthcoming sale of work, with the melancholy emphasis on tea that such events always underline. The older one had a column folded back on itself, as if it had been consulted recently and without much etiquette. "Shall we?" Love asked, meaning nothing urgent, only that they had to resume being policemen in the unglamorous sense. "We shall," said Purbright. They cut through the churchyard's side path, where mourners had already begun to convert sympathy into timetables. Outside, Brayne shook its shoulders and assumed the posture of a town that handled trouble by returning to errands. A few figures hovered by the lich gate as if they had discovered they could not leave just yet without giving themselves away. Alderman Bligh, courting unction in the direction of Mrs. Leeming, Edith's niece, made a statement about her aunt's virtues which, though accurate, sounded rehearsed. Mrs. Boswell was discussing weather with a severity usually reserved for altar cloths. Miss Hask consulted her pencil and nodded to herself as if checking the loyalty of subordinate verbs. Purbright and Love walked the short distance to the vicarage door because hospitality, being institutional, had already begun to assemble itself behind it. In the study, with its initiated smell of paper and something older than paper, the vicar poured tea of the sort one serves to the police when one hopes they will not stay long. He apologized for the milk, for the cups, for the weather, and for Edith. She was a firm woman, he said, stirring with resigned precision. Firmness is so valuable when other people display it. "I'm grateful for your candor," Purbright replied. "I don't know that I have been candid," the vicar said, with a quick brightness that suggested relief. "But I am grateful for your gratitude." Their conversation wandered, with respectability, around the topic of the fund. The vicar explained, in a manner that proposed facts as guests rather than residents, that a subscription had indeed been undertaken to replace timbers in the lich gate that had shown, if not rot, then the intention. There had been enthusiasm at first, as there always is for improvements vaguely attached to heritage and unconnected with drains. Then had come a pause. No one in Brayne called it a dispute, which ended in a decision to suspend appeals pending clarification. The phrase had the feel of something one could frame. Mrs. Pargeter, the vicar said, took a godly interest in arithmetic. She disliked balances that depended on hope. And hope, Purbright observed, is so difficult to receipt. The vicar, hearing a joke enter under the door, allowed it a seat. Yes, she corresponded with Miss Hask, quite strongly, I fear, on the value of transparency. Would it be possible to borrow the back copies of the newsletter? Purbright asked. I am always impressed by what people thought suitable for print when they were not thinking of policemen. I shall have them sent to the station tomorrow morning, the vicar said, in a tone that made tomorrow sound ecclesiastical. Or you may prefer to call on Miss Hask and consult them in her presence, which is, of course, how we prefer to handle the archive. Tomorrow will do very well, said Purbright, who disliked doing anything very well in a hurry. They stood, polite men showing one another to the door. As Purbright turned, he noticed on the corner of the vicar's desk a small square of blotting paper with a row of imprints. Reopen the... The remainder had been truncated by the blotter's edge. The letters were pale and slightly tired, as if the typewriter had an E that did not enjoy exertion. He looked at the vicar, who looked at the blotter with an affection that was nearly applicable to anything. Drafts, the vicar said, smiling thinly. The parish's correspondence is never quite final until it isn't. I had considered issuing a notice about many things. But notices can be so inflammatory. And envelopes, said Purbright. They can be discovered. Indeed. Outside, the afternoon had recovered from ceremony. Behind the churchyard hedge, 2 committee members debated whether arum lilies were vulgar, failing to agree, as was proper. The verger crossed the path carrying a pair of brass vases that looked virtuous even when empty. He nodded to the inspector in the manner of a man who could teach secrets to keep themselves. Love, who had stood in enough porches to acquire opinions about them, breathed the sort of breath one takes when stepping from carpet onto flagstones. "Shall we look in on Miss Hask tomorrow, then?" he said. "Yes," Purbright answered. "Tomorrow will be concerned with reading rather than flowers." They moved away together, their pace modest and unthreatening. At the gate, Purbright paused again and touched, with an absent thumb, the corner of the older newsletter beneath the glass. A fragment of a headline showed where the paper had been folded. Subscript. And then the crease. Some helpful hand had aligned the fold so that the remaining letters fell out of sight. On the inside of the glass, near the pin, there was the whitish smear that furniture polish leaves when it has been applied in haste and with pious intentions. He lowered his hand. A quiet unease, not yet ambitious enough to call itself suspicion, accompanied them down the lane. Behind them in the porch, Alderman Bligh was reassuring Mrs. Leeming that Brayne could not be troubled by old matters for long. Brayne had a way of converting them into custom. In his pocket, the envelope lay against Purbright's fingers like a well-behaved fish. Cool and uncommunicative, he considered the faintly anemic E, the respectable Polish scent, the neatly folded newsletter, and the habit of committees to reassemble as soon as they have disbanded. On the notice board, the older newsletter settled by a fraction, exposing a single additional letter the wind had been nursing. Tion. The parish office had arranged itself, with the passive-aggressive ingenuity of small rooms, against any suggestion of comfort. The chairs were the kind that asked one to sit properly, or not at all. A coal scuttle contributed an air of traditional penance without the impertinence of heat. On the wall above Miss Hask's desk, a framed photograph of the Lich Gate, taken when its timbers looked stout and its sentiments uncontroversial, held a quiet pose of innocence that no longer seemed plausible. Miss Hask herself regarded her visitors in the manner of a headmistress who has agreed to admit 2 promising boys to the library as an experiment. She was tidy to the point of economy. A pencil and a bone folder lay together like a well-married couple. Before her, on a blotter whose margins had been disinfected of personality by years of method, lay a ledger book with the rubied glow of a daily use item. She had already decided, it seemed, the proportions in which cooperation, rebuke, and example would be dispensed. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'm grateful that you chose a morning hour. The afternoon brings callers who do not value quiet, and quiet is what paper requires to be itself." Purbright agreed that quiet improved most things. Love, whose dimensions were insufficiently apologetic for the office, maneuvered himself into a chair and succeeded in looking smaller without any overt distortion. At a word from Miss Hask, a narrow cupboard opened. This required only the lifting of an eyebrow. In parish offices, furniture understands, and out came 2 bound annuals of the Brayne Parish newsletter. Their buckram had the yielding stiffness of respectable shoes. She set them on the desk with the solemnity of a registrar presenting a child to its name. "Complete runs, naturally," she said. "Each year bound in January. Corrections included where necessary and where possible without inviting litigation." Purbright ran a hand over the buckram and found that the weave spoke the truth. "You keep everything, Miss Hask." "Everything that was fit to be printed," she corrected. "And some that was not, but had the sort of plainness that defeats censorship by making it dull." Love, to whom literature had seldom appeared in buckram, examined the gilt lettering in a way that suggested he would have been an attentive pupil given kinder infancy. "We are interested," Purbright said, "in the subscription fund." Miss Hask did not need to ask which one. The town had entertained many subscriptions, missionary boxes, lint for soldiers, cushions for pious backs, but only one had achieved the permanence of a quarrel. She opened the volume at a place that had known frequent consultation. A ribbon lay there in readiness, colourless with duty. "There," she said. "The appeal launched on the 4th Sunday after Trinity. A photograph after the rain. Mr. Biddle's son took it. Clouds flatter the hopeful." The headline was mine. "For the gate of welcome. Help us renew what welcomes you." It reads well out loud. Love murmured that it did. He did not repeat it. Brayne's headline sounded better once. Purbright bent to the column. The text was kind, decent, certain of itself. The lich gate had suffered. Modern weather was not what it was. Wood required prophylactic attention. Contributions were to be acknowledged in the newsletter unless modestly declined. A committee had been formed to oversee expenditure, with Alderman Bligh as chairman because, as Miss Hask said without critique, he was difficult to refuse in those years, particularly when he was right. "Minutes," Purbright said. Of course. Her bone folder lifted a thin sheaf of printed notes that had, quite by chance, been waiting under the ribbon. "We printed summaries at first. The public enjoys the architecture of decision. But when disappointment set in, we felt a more discreet approach advisable." "The money went missing?" Love asked, in a tone carefully mixed from curiosity and tact. Miss Hask considered him as one might consider a soup that had surprised by being better than it looked. "There was, Sergeant, a period in which the fund's balance declined in a manner not directly proportional to the work performed. We did not publish the arithmetic. Arithmetic, once public, behaves like a wasp." Purbright lifted a second volume and allowed the pages to drift beneath his fingers. The tone altered subtly after midsummer. Appeals became updates, updates became explanations, explanations became slender. He noticed letters to the editor, signed with initials that looked like pseudonyms created to be solved. A.B. deplored the slowness with which timber aged when left to parish committees to consider it. E.P. defended caution in expenditures made where sentiment tends to overcharge the account. S.W. suggested that grants might be sought and, failing them, hope. The letters grew crisp, then brittle. What had begun as collective uplift set listlessly in the mold of mild siege. "Outrage," Purbright said, almost to himself, "when bottled, ferments. It keeps too." "We had a good year for letters," Miss Hask said, neither proud nor apologetic. "The editor is grateful for outrage so long as it can be set in type. There were 2 pamphlets in reply. Handbills, really, from those who objected to the editor's selection. I have one still. It uses capital letters in a spirit of adventure." Love turned another page and found, inconspicuously placed between a notice for a Mothers' Union talk on Victorian laundries and an advertisement for Mr. Thripp's economical nails, a line stating that the appeal was temporarily suspended pending clarification. It had the punctuation of a resolution and the breathlessness of a prayer. Alderman Bligh was chairman, Purbright said, though the list of committee members had already supplied him with the obvious. "He accepted the duty," Miss Hask answered. "He resigned it, under persuasion, once indignation had become more energetic than productive. The committee can be generous to human weakness, but prefers it to be tidier than arithmetic allows. Alderman Bligh and arithmetic have never been on unfriendly terms. They simply keep different hours." Purbright shut the volume gently. "And Mrs. Pargeter?" "Edith disliked ungentlemanly accounts," said Miss Hask, with the faint approval one accords to an apt summary. She held that charity should be both charitable and countable. She did not believe figures which insisted on being read in the evening. Her mouth performed a small, almost fond line. She kept a private tally. She would say, "There is what we feel and there is what we owe. The first cannot be spent on the second." A discouraging principle, but useful. "A private tally," Purbright repeated. "A ledger, then." "I would not dignify it with the word," Miss Hask said, which meant that she did. She wrote in a child's exercise book because proper ledgers give offences the wrong kind of grandeur. Love rubbed the edge of a page with a careful thumb, preserving respect for binding. "The letters," he said. "These initials. Do you keep the originals?" "Certainly not," said Miss Hask, who kept everything. "We keep copies of significant contributions as a defense against forgetfulness. People forget what they chose to say. It is one of the few habits that comforts editors." Purbright accepted the doctrine and turned to a year later. There the Lichgate returned in photographs, not as an achieved triumph nor as a ruin, but as a background ornament to fate tables and confirmations. It presented itself to Brayne like an elderly relative placed by the hearth. Its presence required acknowledgement and tact, but not action. "The missing funds," Purbright said, remaining inside the room's careful temperature. "Were they ever located?" "They were," Miss Hask replied, tiredly restored. "Not always in the original denominations." She allowed herself a glance, half amusement, half ink, towards a clipping pinned under the blotter corner. "A notice of thanks to those anonymous donors whose modesty exceeds their generosity only by a very little." She covered it with the bone folder before either policeman could read it out. "We did not print that line. I kept it because it was funny." "Anonymous donors," Purbright repeated. "Did any of them, by accident, resemble those who had once had the keeping of the subscription box under their counters?" "The town would never be so literal," Miss Hask said. "Brayne corrects itself, Inspector, but it prefers to do so under the cloak of a good intention. You will find that apologies here are often paid in installments and signed by nobody." "It must make accounting an act of faith," Purbright said. "It does," she said, "but not always of charity." They worked through the letters. EP appeared with the regularity of a conscience. SW declined to tire. A JL asked questions so courteously that their edge cut softly and continuously. Purbright inquired without pressure how many typewriters were, or had been, employed in the production of the parish's debate. Miss Hask answered with a short list. The newsletter's own machine with a faintly asthmatic E. The vicarage's office typewriter, a brighter instrument. Owned by Hope. One at the ironmonger, energetic capitals. And more distantly, a device used occasionally by the alderman's secretary for drafting statements he did not in the end release. "We know our letters by their gait," she said. "Some trot, some hobble. One or two cannot resist cantering." Purbright, who had been thinking faintly of the Coffin's envelope with its well-behaved type, nodded in a manner that left room. Love's finger paused at the edge of a page where a correction had been obliged to admit itself. "In our last issue, a misprint rendered subscriptions as suspicions. We regret the levity." "That was not a misprint," said Miss Hask without remorse. "The compositor had views." "It is not always easy," Purbright said, "to distinguish the two." "Quite," she said. A clock somewhere above the cupboard produced the gentle warning by which parish officers prepare their morning to surrender to luncheon. The air of the room, already lean, thinned as if the filing cabinets had taken their ration and locked the door. Purbright asked if the annuals could be left on a side table for another hour. Miss Hask allowed that they might, so long as pages were returned to the same month in which they had been found. "And one more matter," Purbright said, selecting a tone which would sound unalarmingly in retelling. "Was Mrs. Pargeter ever a member of the Lichgate Committee?" "She was," Miss Hask said, "briefly, because there was some idea among certain ladies that the presence of an exact woman would discourage the vergers of men. The idea was at first vindicated and then found to be impractical." "Practicality is often the enemy of ideas," Purbright suggested. "Indeed." She turned a small drawer and took out a postcard, the sort sent when we are doing something useful elsewhere and wish to wound without rudeness. She resigned by postcard. It was addressed to me because she could not be sure the chairman would preserve it. "Dear Miss Hask," it says, "please accept my resignation from the committee. I cannot reconcile our minutes with our purse, and I am advised by experience not to attempt to reconcile either with my conscience. Yours sincerely, E. Pargeter." I kept a copy because I imagined, correctly, that one day someone would deny she had written it. Purbright read the lines twice. The handwriting, tidied to the point of dissuasion, had been written by a pen that did not side with ink when ink wobbled. He returned the card to the drawer without asking for it. He found that things one could demand were less useful than things one could remember. "Was the resignation acknowledged?" Love asked. "Formally, in the minutes," said Miss Hask. "Informally, by the chairman, in a speech delivered with a tone I shall describe as brave." He observed that Mrs. Pargeter undoubtedly meant well. The phrase was not, in my view, efficacious. "And Alderman Bligh withdrew," Purbright said, "minutes after money was discovered, absent?" "Almost precisely," Miss Hask replied. "He believed that his presence, while naturally valuable for morale, might be misunderstood. He told me he had always disliked subscriptions because gratitude seldom balances properly. I told him that arithmetic also dislikes them." The room had by now exhausted conversation in a civilized way. Miss Hask closed the annuals and placed upon them the bone folder as one might place a letter weight upon an idea that might otherwise fly. She supervised the return of a loose clipping to its correct month, accepted Purbright's thanks with the professional neutrality of a woman who has long been thanked for doing what others would have preferred not to be necessary, and stood. "You will, I suppose," she said, "speak with Alderman Bligh. If you do, I encourage you to keep to mornings. His afternoons are sometimes occupied by hindsight." Purbright said he would choose a time before hindsight had fully arranged its adjectives. Love, negotiating the chair with the good manners of a large man withdrawing from a delicately set table, asked whether there were any other documents the inspector should be aware of. "None that prove anything," said Miss Hask. "Only those that make proof unnecessary." They had reached the door when Purbright paused in that unthreatening way he had acquired for applying small questions to closed drawers. He returned to the desk and, with a single finger, indicated a faint square on the blotter, an area not more than 3 inches by 2 where the green had a lighter, recently uncovered tone. The rectangle was precisely where a postcard might lie if used as a guide for typing addresses. "You have been busy with envelopes?" he asked, as if the subject were garden pests. "Editors," said Miss Hask, "are always busy with envelopes." "Of course," he said. They stepped into the corridor. Here the church's older heir lived in a home of wood polish and resigned dust. A notice board at shoulder height offered, in equable rows, the minutes of the Mothers' Union, a request for jam jars, and a list of books missing from the parish library, each with a sternly forgiving note reminding readers that forgetfulness is a sin they could still cure. Near the bottom, a pinned slip, smaller than the rest, announced that past committee members of the Lichgate appeal were invited to attend an informal review of matters satisfactorily concluded. The words, "to Purbright's eye," had the curve of something that needed a pin at either end. Outside, Brayne went about its selective amnesia. The vicar's cat elected to pass them on the step, glancing once with the neutrality of clergy. Purbright stood a moment and looked through the glass back into the office. Miss Hask had not resumed her seat. She stood at the filing cabinet with a key in her hand and a posture one might call patient if one did not suspect that patience can also be a position of attack. She replaced the postcard in its drawer, closed it, turned the key, and then drew a small bottle from the desk. The faintest vapor caught the light before she applied a trace of polish to the desk edge where it met the green blotter, an indulgence that made the wood shine and, indisputably, scent the air. "Furniture polish," Love said mildly, because saying so recorded the fact without giving it more importance than it could yet claim. "Quite," said Purbright. He did not write anything down. Certain odours, like certain phrases, adhere best to recollection. He led the way down the steps with the air of a man who has learned something that will only agree to be useful later. On the pavement, a pillar box stood with its habitual fatigue. He glanced at its slot, narrow, official, and exacting, and then at the parish office window where the blinds had come down against noon and inquiry. He considered the practice of resigning by postcard and how resignation, in the right hands, could be a form of persistence. They turned towards the high street. Behind them, in the cooled quiet, an unseen clock allowed itself to strike the half-hour with a kind of modest triumph. And somewhere, between the drawer that held Edith's careful lines and the bound annuals that held Brayne's less careful ones, a surface retained just enough of a scent to make a sensible man wonder how long polish announces where a letter has lately lain, and whether the habit of tending wood could teach someone the evenness needed for rapping out words with a tired letter E. Alderman Bligh received callers on his front step with an expression designed for photographers who might be late and auditors who never were. The house, a square edifice with aspirations to stucco, wore its respectability as if purchased in bulk and applied annually. Brass polished itself there. Hydrangeas kept their manners. Doorbells chimed as though vetoing vulgarity. Purbright, who had encountered civic virtue in a variety of domestic costumes, found this one well cut. "Inspector," Bligh said, extending a hand whose firmness had been in training for years. "And Sergeant. You are good to attend upon me at such short notice. Please be assured I shall not waste your morning. I dislike to be wasteful about anything." Love, apologizing to the furniture merely by entering, followed Purbright into a hall that had learned to smell faintly of lavender when nothing else could be agreed. The umbrella stand contained the plausible number of umbrellas for a man who imagined rain to be a personal discourtesy. A portrait of Bligh and his aldermanic chain considered them with suitable anxiety. In the drawing-room, a tea-tray had been arranged with such conscientious symmetry that one suspected a blueprint. The cups were thin, the saucers were small, the sugar tongs looked startled to be necessary. Bligh poured with the care of a man who anticipated letters to the editor about spilling. "I must begin," he said, "by expressing my sorrow that Mrs. Pargeter's funeral should have acquired an administrative complication. I do not mean to be indelicate, Inspector, but grief, when burdened with paperwork, becomes unbecoming. That is one reason, one of several, why I withdrew from the Lichgate matter. Hysteria, arithmetic." Here he made a small rehearsed gesture with the teaspoon. "The combination is positively unhygienic." Purbright tasted the tea and discovered it had been brewed according to public guidance. "Hygiene," he said, "is certainly desirable in accounts." "Quite," said Bligh, with the look of a man who has invented both the word and its application. "Regrettable misinterpretations occurred. I was, as you may be aware, chairman of the committee only so long as my presence prevented, rather than produced, confusion. When I saw the situation becoming, well, over-interpretive, I told the vicar that my withdrawal would save tempers and timber. I do not boast about self-sacrifice. I merely record it." Love held his cup at that angle which expressed duty rather than thirst. One might say the tea was drinking love. "Names," said Purbright, with an amiability that belonged to Gardens. "You will help me by recalling the composition of the committee at the time of your resignation." "Gladly." Bligh set his cup down upon a saucer that had been coached for the moment. "There was Miss Hask, of course. Editors are indispensable when delicacy is involved. Mr. Thrip, whose interest in wood was practical, if sometimes, how shall I put it, overconfident regarding cash flow. Mrs. Boswell lent her influence from the loft. Mr. Swithins from the estate agency. He came late and left early, a useful habit which did not survive the minutes. The vicar sat ex officio, and I sat on everything else. There were others, good souls whose attendance was more theoretical than empirical. He spoke the names lightly, a gracious man assisting memory across a road, yet each struck in Purbright's mind a second bell. The initials that had paraded in the newsletter's letters page like solicitors' windows, a BSWJL, now stood with their hats off. EP, he thought, had never disguised itself. Edith Pargeter, Purbright asked, the question passing along the carpet without taking up space. Mrs. Pargeter, Bligh said, employing the tone required for women whose accounts balance, was briefly a member. She possessed, if I may, a purse-lipped insistence on receipts. A virtue, naturally, but I found it spiritually diminishing to have benevolence translated into columns the very moment it took breath. She was, in many ways, exact, and exactness can be invaluable so long as it is not evangelical. She resigned by postcard, an economy I respected if not admired. And the fund, Purbright said. It suffered misinterpretation. Precisely. Bligh leaned back a watched inch. Misinterpretation, Inspector, is the tax levied on public service by those who find it difficult to serve. Money was not so much missing as misapplied, temporarily and under proper supervision. When the woodworm scare abated, the need altered, the will dwindled, and one made adjustments. What suffered was tone. Tone is the lich-gate of public life. Love permitted himself a fractional brow. Tone, in his experience, made less satisfactory gates than iron. Purbright set his cup down and produced from an inner pocket the envelope discovered in the satin folds of Mrs. Pargeter's coffin. He placed it on the tablecloth, a respectable white that had not expected to be involved. You may have heard of this. Bligh laughed in the key of reassurance, then allowed it to stop almost before anyone else had noticed. An oddity, he said, a theatricality. And in a church, too, though one may argue that the founding literature of our civilization is not innocent of dramatic gesture. He looked not quite at the envelope. I cannot see that it concerns me. The words, were their words, must be directed at those who enjoy dwelling on bygones. I do not. Purbright, whose enjoyment of anything was never visible, tapped the envelope as if to confirm it contained paper rather than doctrine. It says, "Reopen the subscription fund," typed a tired E. A tired, Bligh began, and then shook his head as if clearing a witticism from his throat. There is a man in town, Mr. Vass, the undertaker, who has views on envelopes. He might have been asked to enclose or to extract or to deplore. Undertakers influence paper almost as often as vicars influence weather. Consult him. He is, competent within his sphere. We shall, said Purbright. Conversation proceeded to those parts of civic life that could be praised without witnesses. Bligh regretted the death of local trifles. Lace curtains, small auctions, the reliable distance of London. He spoke of the diocese, which had found new vigor in aged stones, and of how the town must position itself among grant-givers without appearing to do so. He lamented gracefully the passage of time over men who had believed in it less than it believed in them. Purbright listened in the way of a man who could be mistaken for the furniture by the furniture. His eyes, which never lost their habit of inventory, moved over the room. Photographs not far enough apart, a clock that managed to be decorous while being wrong, a row of folders in municipal green behind a half-closed bureau flap. On the mantelpiece, between two pieces of pottery whose price had once been misdescribed as modest, hung a framed letter. Its paper had yellowed to that tone which reassures the timid about permanence. The frame, however, had a fresh brilliance to its glass, the unfoxed clearness of something that had not learned to live in a house. The wood, a nicely battered moulding with its self-esteem intact, should have produced a corresponding dullness. It did not. Bligh noticed the inspection as a host notices drafts. Ah, he said casually, a note of thanks from the diocesan treasurer. We were able to assist, modestly, with a heritage appeal dear to his heart. He writes a splendid hand, almost Roman. People appreciate a hand that has the courage of its ink. Love, who had been pretending an interest in the clock's incorrectness, spoke with that soft neutrality he reserved for matters that might later require remembering. "Glass looks new," he said. "A good fit." "One must occasionally refresh one's frames," Bligh replied, turning the phrase over like a coin one intends to pass presently. "Dust plays the vandal." "The treasurer's name?" Purbright asked. "Canon Pelham," said Bligh at once. "A robust pen, as you see." Purbright nodded at the signature, which had indeed entered the page with athletic confidence. The letter itself, in its polite paragraphs, thanked Alderman Bligh for continuing support of the diocese's heritage efforts and made graceful mention of your town's lich gate, which so charmingly frames the estates of the blessed dead. The date, which had been selected to appear shy, belonged to a month after the committee's official suspension of appeals. That could mean little or much. It hung there between the mantel ornaments like a harmless insect. They returned to safer ground. Bligh supplied, when asked, a handwritten list of the committee members, produced from a drawer with the speed of a man accustomed to providing lists rather than answers. The names, rounded and unostentatious in a careful hand, were familiar in the way of people seen on Sundays from the back. Purbright recognized some immediately, others by association. In the space where motives usually appear, there was only a courteous emptiness. "Is there anything else I may place at your disposal?" Bligh asked, standing because one ought, before men who also stand. "I will not have it said that I fail to assist law and order simply because law and order, on occasion, fails to assist itself." "You have been very obliging," Purbright said. "Undertaker Vass, then. And perhaps I may look again, in due course, at your correspondence concerning the fund." "My correspondence is never ashamed of itself," Bligh replied serenely. "It simply becomes historical." In the hall, while hats negotiated heads in the reflective manner hats have when they feel scrutinized by frames, Love nodded toward the letter on the mantel and allowed himself the smallest observation. "Glass newer than the wood," he said. "Clean cut to the rebate, too. Recent work." "And a robust pen," Purbright said. "Let us not forget the pen." The door performed its duty with a soft sigh that had been taught to resemble warmth. On the step, the hydrangeas resumed their police work. Beyond the iron railings, Brayne proceeded with its business of being watched by itself. "Do you suppose," Love said as they reached the pavement, "that he hangs gratitude now because there was not enough of it when it would have been useful?" "People hang many things when dust is inconvenient," Purbright replied. "Thanks among them." They went a few yards without further comment. A delivery boy, whose bicycle was in a state of permanent apology, dismounted and toted up the steps a narrow parcel insured against curiosity. He pressed the bell with a finger that had learned its manners from Greece. Purbright, not disrupting the boy's transaction with posterity, glanced at the label as it passed level with his view. Pelham and Bright, glaziers and art framers. The string, unambiguously new, had not yet accepted Dust's argument. Love pretended to remove a speck from his coat. "Frames do tire," he said. "They do," Purbright agreed. "So do stories." They walked on, drawing civil conclusions that they did not say aloud. At the corner, a breath of polish drifted from a furniture shop opened for the morning. It was the decent sort, without citrus. The undertaker's premises lay farther along, across from the telegraph office, where envelopes were given both their beginning and their excuses. Purbright felt the small weight of the Coffin letter against his inner pocket and reflected, not unkindly, on Bligh's rehearsal of phrases, those labored conjunctions of virtue and necessity, hysteria and arithmetic indeed. He stopped once and looked back. Through the still open doorway, he could see the Drawing room as a stage sees itself when the audience has left. Bligh had not yet returned to the mantel. He hovered at his writing bureau with a tilt of the head that might be taken for thought or for posture. He picked up a fountain pen from a stand that kept two others in modest subordination. The nib he selected was of the kind that made a statement even when capped. On the mantel, the framed letter caught the light obediently. For the first time, Purbright noticed, because he had turned away before, that the mounts inside the frame did not quite align with the deckled edge. A thinner rectangle showed faintly on the backboard, a paler ghost where a smaller document had once lain pressed. Love, seeing nothing and everything at once, murmured, "New glass, old footprint, and a treasurer with a robust pen," said Purbright. He turned towards the undertakers, carrying with him the mild question that persists when a host's smile, like his glazing, has lately been replaced, whether the letter thanked generosity or merely learned to look like it. Mr. Vass ran funerals with the tact of a locksmith who suspected all doors of harboring secrets. His premises, set between the telegraph office and a shop that sold lampshades to people who believed shadows to be a moral failing, displayed a studied neutrality. Curtains that declined to express taste, lilies disciplined into arrangements, and a mantel clock that had not once admitted to striking. The air held the agreeable suggestion of wax rather than of grief, as if sorrow might be polished to a tolerable sheen. Purbright and Love were received in a room furnished for recollection and invoices. Mr. Vass, a narrow man whose suit implied a once prosperous ancestor, stood with the gentle alertness of someone prepared to be useful in the correct way. He had the undertaker's knack of appearing to agree without committing his face. "You are very kind," Purbright said, because politeness had found its natural habitat here. "We would be grateful for any clarity you can offer regarding Mrs. Pargeter's arrangements." "Clarity is buried under paper," said Mr. Vass, without humor and not unaware of it. "But we can exhume what is customary. The coffin was sealed under Miss Hask's eye after a tidy viewing, very tidy. Mrs. Pargeter had given it to be understood that residue, emotional or otherwise, should be minimal. We complied. There is comfort in procedure." "Quite," said Purbright. "And the letter?" "I do not place it," Vass replied. "We lay the satin. We permit the respectful to say farewell. We replace the cover. During viewing, there were 2 moments when Miss Hask left the chapel to instruct the verger about the hymn numbers. There is a kind of arithmetic there, I believe, and 1 moment when I myself stepped to the office to answer the telephone. Beyond that, there was only the ordinary tidying of the sorrowful. The letter was unstamped," Lave observed diffidently, as though offering a saucer he did not wish to claim. "Unsealed." "Then whoever placed it did not expect the post," said Vass. "You will find that last thoughts are often not concerned with stamps." He crossed to a narrow desk and opened a ledger whose pages had resigned themselves to the pen. "We have a call log," he said. "It is useful, in the event of complaints about timing, to have the hour by which guilt can be distributed." "An excellent practice," Purbright murmured. Vass consulted a column with the air of a man visiting a cemetery whose tenants he knew. "The night before the funeral," he said, "at 21 minutes past 8, there was a call. The voice, man or woman, possibly both, inquired when the chapel would be quiet enough for last thoughts." That exact phrase. It had the unnatural naturalness of rehearsal. I explained that the chapel was closed at 8. The voice replied that a few minutes would supply what was needed if God cooperated. I observed that we could not guarantee him. "A sensible disclaimer," said Purbright. The caller persisted, Vass continued, and requested the time at which the chapel would next be unattended. "We keep a person within earshot between the hours of 7 and 10. I said as much. The voice thanked me in a tone which wished to sound thin and grateful, and did not. "You noted the number," Purbright said, though he had already seen how this would end. Vass turned the ledger for their benefit. its ruled lines giving the impression that conscience might be encouraged by geometry. A column of digits sat with modest pride alongside the request. Love, who could locate an address in a telephone exchange as surely as he could locate a kettle in a village hall, read them off and glanced towards Purbright with the expression of a schoolboy who has found the answer under the master's thumb. The number belonged to the vicarage extension, the one used, as Mr. Vass recalled, by parish committees on wet evenings when democracy threatens to stain carpets. "The vicarage," said Purbright neutrally. "It has a pleasing ring," said Mr. Vass. "Many of our calls originate there, though few employ phrases. We are accustomed to people inquiring about flowers, pallbearers, and whether hymn number 230 might be considered triumphant under the circumstances. Last thoughts is less usual." "Who has access to the extension?" Love asked. "Those who form committees," Vass replied, "and those who attend them." Purbright closed the ledger gently. He had long ago learned that the best question is the one not asked in front of a book. "You mentioned a tidy viewing," he said. "Who attended?" "Miss Hask, who supervises tidiness when it appears in public, and Mrs. Leeming, the niece. The vicar came for a moment to form a prayer over the lilies, his word, and to check that the brass had not offended the sanctuary. Edith Pargeter," Vass added, remembering his protocols and finding them pleasingly complete, had expressed certain preferences. She asked, for instance, that her handbag be placed at her feet, just in case. "Just in case," repeated Purbright. "Did she specify the case?" "She did not. People do not. Just in case is the phrase for arrangements with God. The handbag was a stout leather contrivance of the kind that implies a woman with voters in it. We obliged." "Was that unusual?" Love asked, interested in the anthropological side of funeral furniture. "Only as a matter of position," Vass replied. "We have interred a variety of personal items at customers' requests. Hymnals, cigarettes, a pair of reading glasses to assist in approving heaven from a distance, a small cookbook, and, in one instance, a complete set of minutes from a bridge club tied with blue ribbon. People expect continuity. They would be disappointed to find the next world insufficiently supplied." "And after the funeral," Purbright said, "the handbag?" "It had been placed at her feet and remained there until sealing," Vass said. "After interment, it would, in the ordinary course, have remained there forever. However, on the morning of the funeral, there arrived a message from Mrs. Leeming requesting, very politely, that we restore the handbag to the family. It was brought to the house after the burial. I'm told sentiment attached to it. Sentiment often has pockets." Purbright said nothing to this. It had the shape of a thought already filed. Miss Hask had spoken of a ledger kept by Edith in a child's exercise book. A handbag accustomed to holding order might also have held order's proofs. Love, whose curiosity had been trained not to look like curiosity, asked whether Mr. Vass's staff had noticed anyone loitering near the chapel after hours the previous evening. Vass shook his head. "Our young man was polishing the beer with a conscientiousness that easily withstands vagrants. We trust him with brass and with silence. He reported only the cat's visit, which did not require the door to be unlatched." "And you, Mr. Vass," Purbright said, "have views on envelopes?" The undertaker allowed himself a shade of appreciation at the courtesy of the question. "Only practical ones. Paper behaves in churches. It absorbs damp in a well-brought-up manner. If one wished to place an envelope upon satin so that it would stay where it had been invited, one would ensure it had sufficient weight. This can be achieved by choosing heavy paper, as your envelope suggests. It would also be wise to lay it with the flap towards the pillow to prevent the cover catching it when replaced. Whoever placed that letter knew the small mechanics of altars. Or they have the sort of sense that makes them good at curtains." "Thank you," said Purbright. "Few things are so useful as a mind untroubled by metaphor." "Undertaking discourages it," Vass replied. "There are only so many ways to say lift and lower without becoming impolite." They walked with him through to the chapel, which had been rendered neutral with such dignity that even the flowers felt underdressed. The beer, black and abstemious, stood in a position from which one might observe the habits of a community without being seen by it. A lectern held a Bible open to verses that had comforted almost everyone in the abstract. Mr. Vass gestured, with a hand that feared to insist, to the corner in which families waited to be examined by their composure. "Miss Hask stood there," he said. "She does not support herself by furniture. She prefers the moral kind." Mrs. Leeming sat for a moment and then stood, because sitting makes people feel as if they have overslept. "Did either of them handle the coffin?" Love asked. "Only the edges. Miss Hask has a patient horror of thumbprints. There were none." They returned to the office, where Vass consulted an index card and produced a copy of the inventory that accompanied the coffin to the grave. It was tidy in a manner that discouraged improvements. "Personal effects," he read. "To wit, a small rosary. Despite being Anglican, people like the feel of them. 2 handkerchiefs clean, and handbag. Contents unspecified." "Contents unspecified," Purbright repeated. "A policy or an omission?" "Both," said Vass. "We do not list contents unless asked. Families do not invite us to do so unless provoked." A pause inhabited the room with more success than most people. Vass permitted it to stand and then filled it with a remembered kindness. Mrs. Pargeter was precise but not parsimonious. Years ago she paid for a headstone for a poor parishioner's mother. Anonymously, though not successfully, the vicar leaked goodness as if it were grace. Someone wrote to complain about the font. It was too modern, or too old. I forget which, because complaints supply both. "People dislike letters in stone as much as in print," Love said. "They do," said Vass. "They prefer their sentiments to live on paper, where they can be adjusted." Purbright folded the copy inventory and put it away with the careful acknowledgement one gives to documents that may later become part of a sermon. "If you will forgive another small inquiry," he said, "the call last night, the voice, did it sound local?" "It sounded like someone translating themselves into respectability," said Vass. "It is a dialect favoured in Brayne. Sex seemed an optional extra." Purbright thanked him. They took their leave with that subdued gratitude which suits rooms trained to hear it. In the outer office, a respectable clock admitted it was noon by pretending to have only just noticed. Beyond the door, the street laid out its ordinary temptations: telegrams, tea, and pinning things to notice boards as if permanence were a hobby. On the pavement, Love allowed the small observation he had been carrying to put its head out. "Phone number, Vicarage Extension," he said. "Committees on wet evenings. Last night's weather was clear." "Which reduces the attendance," said Purbright, "but not necessarily the enthusiasm for the extension." They walked without haste. The undertaker's windows reflected them with more tact than accuracy. Across the way, a woman stood outside the telegraph office translating anxiety into capital letters. A delivery boy conveyed a parcel that, being for no one in particular, would shortly enter history as a mistake. Brayne made itself agreeable to being watched. The handbag, Love ventured, to be placed at her feet just in case. Case might be arithmetic. Or posterity, Purbright said. Or modesty. Miss Hask reported a ledger. Mrs. Leeming will have accepted something that contained it without noticing it contained anything. Grief prefers metaphors to totals. They had reached the corner when Purbright paused because the air, easily offended, had changed by a note. Outside the lampshade shop, a young assistant appeared with a bottle and a rag and applied polish to the doorframe in exact semicircular motions. The smell, respectable, dulled, moved dutifully across the pavement. It was the same scent that had clung lightly to the envelope recovered from Saturn, and not unlike that which frequented the parish office whenever Miss Hask believed Wood to be making a point. Love noticed it as one notices a parishioner who makes a practice of being noticed modestly. "Furniture polish again," he said. "Brayne's civic incense," Purbright replied. "We may assume miracles where scent persists and fingerprints do not." They resumed. A child, denied entry to the undertakers by an instinct older than rules, watched them go with a frown he would later employ for arithmetic. Purbright considered, with his habitual economy of judgment, the data presently to hand. An envelope placed with knowledge of fabric, a telephone call that had the accent of committees, a handbag just in case, and a dead woman who had preferred numbers to narratives. The shapes sat together obligingly, but not yet socially. At the corner pillar box, which had the air of having been lectured into staying, Purbright paused again. The red paint had been freshened in places, not others, creating a modest patchwork of diligence and habit. On its base, someone had tied a length of string, a mean strip left from a parcel. It was new, determined to look respectable, and altogether unnecessary, much like the new glass in Alderman Bligh's frame. Love followed his glance and observed nothing aloud. "Shall we call on Mrs. Leeming?" he said. "We shall," replied Purbright. "We will inquire whether grief has a key to a drawer, and whether drawers retain the smell of polish when letters have been folded there." They turned towards the quieter street where Mrs. Leeming lived, leaving behind them the undertaker's door with its newly brightened frame. In the reflection, for a moment, the room within showed the neat rectangle on Mr. Vass's desk, where the call ledger lay when consulted, and the exactness with which he replaced it. The sort of neatness that either reflects honesty or practices for it. And somewhere between the chapel's bier and the vicarage extension, a rehearsed phrase, quiet enough for last thoughts, shaped itself again in Purbright's ear, the voluntary of someone composing virtue for an audience they hoped would be smaller than a congregation. Mrs. Joan Leeming received the police with a politeness that pre-strained coffee, as if civility might be more palatable once filtered. Her sitting room had the corrective air of a place that had been told, patiently and for years, how it ought to look. Cushions settled in approved positions, a rug kept to its rectangle with missionary zeal. The windows had the zealously innocent gloss that follows industrious Saturday mornings. Edith Pargeter had not lived here, but one felt she might have supervised it by letter. "Inspector, Sergeant, you are very kind to call," Joan said, and then, because kindness can become argumentative if not watered, she offered coffee. It arrived in cups that had learned to tolerate milk. Purbright chose a chair that promised no surprises. Love selected one that accepted his height as a lapse rather than a fault. "It was the undertaker," Joan began, settling her skirt the way punctuality settles calendars, who telephoned after the burial. "He said Aunt Edith's handbag had been restored to the family at my request, which I had made, and that I might find, as he put it, continuities within. I do not often look for continuity in handbags, Inspector. One finds receipts and powder. The future seldom turns up." She placed the handbag on the table with a respect just short of confession. It was the kind of leather that had been young when newspapers were larger. Its clasp yielded to her with the minute sigh of things accustomed to proper handling. From within, she drew a narrow exercise book, the kind used to teach ruled lines their duties, and set it before them with the caution one applies to fragile ornaments. "An exercise book," she said. "I had hoped for a letter." Purbright opened the covers. Columns of figures, initials, and dates had arranged themselves with the menace of an upright piano, orderly and forbidding in equal measure. The headings were written in a hand that had not trembled for anyone. The sums to the right had the dryness of a vicar's prayer over a bill. There were entries marked by initials he had seen before, A.B., S.W.J.L., and by sums that looked like small grudges settled in coins. At intervals, whole strips of paper had been neatly razored out, leaving even wounds. The book's spine showed the faint fatigue of having been opened to the same places too often. "Someone has been at this with care," Purbright said. Joan colored in the way tidy people do when disorder is revealed in their orbit. "I did not," I found it like that. Aunt Edith disliked tearing. She thought it vulgar. She kept a paper knife at the bottom of the bookcase. A small pause. But I've not seen it since the vicar came to call on Tuesday. Paper knife, Love said, neutral as steam. A little bone one, Joan added. Clergy prefer bone, I think. It is the ecclesiastical material. Purbright turned a page. Between two sets of numbers lay a thin blue leaf, carbon copy paper, slightly greasy to the touch, the sort that leaves loyalty on fingers. He loosened it with a forefinger that could tickle facts out of paper without hurting them. Behind it, onion skin, typed. A heading, Miss Hask, re the gate. The words had aligned with that joyless confidence one associates with machines. The letters showed the fatigue of usefulness. The E in particular had begun to print like a retiring aunt, present but keen not to impose. He read. The tone was brisk, too precise to be reproach, and therefore harder to forgive. If the gate is to stand, certain persons must first step down. There followed a series of moral arithmetic problems arranged as sentences. Names were not supplied, initials were, which in Brayne is anonymity's contribution to gossip. At the bottom, a date. Purbright had already paired it with one in his head. Alderman Bligh's resignation, the afternoon in which he had discovered, with admirable promptness, that his presence might be misunderstood. You see the date, Joan said, looking at the mantle rather than the page. People often stared at mantles when numbers were about to become theological. She had no wish to shame anyone, Inspector. She believed that shame should be paid, not printed. Very compassionate, Purbright said, without letting compassion do the work. I do not say she was kindly about it, Joan admitted. But she did not believe kindness and truth were often on speaking terms. The type, though weary, was legible. Its E wore thin. Its R had acquired a bite. The capitals lined themselves with the modest tilt of a machine slightly off its plinth. He slid the onion skin back beneath the carbon, a courtesy given to secrets. The next page presented further columns, entries that balanced barely, and the confident white of excisions. Any arithmetic that had threatened to turn into story had been cut away with obedient edges. Portions are missing, he observed. My aunt had the habit of removing anything that looked like future embarrassment, Joan said. For others, not for herself. Did she ever mention a ledger? Love asked. To the vicar or Miss Hask? She mentioned everything to Miss Hask, Joan said, the sentence wearing a faint apology like a shawl. Miss Hask told her to keep notes because men sleep on minutes. It gave Aunt Edith something to do when she could not sleep. She would sit up and count. She said numbers added better after 11. Purbright laid the exercise book beside the handbag. The bag's interior offered what handbags do. A compact, a battered membership card for a library that considered silence a sacrament, 2 clean handkerchiefs and, at the very bottom, a half-folded small square of grease-proof paper that had once protected a piece of carbon. He touched it with a finger. The print it left was faithful in the E. She had lately drafted a second letter, Joan said, with the air of repeating a line one has practiced until it no longer resists. She said it was to be opened if... Her hand drifted in the unsophisticated direction of the cemetery. But I cannot find it. I've looked in drawers and the tea tin and even behind the range, where charwomen hide things to make time pass. Did your aunt type her own letters? Purbright asked. When forced, Joan said. She preferred proper pens. That carbon copy is hers, typed on Miss Hask's machine. I recognized the tired E. Aunt would borrow it of a Tuesday when she went to help with the newsletter seals and to supervise hyphenation. She did not approve of hyphens that called attention to themselves. And here, said Love, who had been watching the room learn to be helpful, the Morning Post. On the sideboard lay a small gathering of envelopes that had not yet achieved importance. Joan had placed them in a stack as firmly hopeful people stack disappointments. She drew the topmost and held it out between forefinger and thumb. It was the size and quality of envelopes bought by people who believe paper should be a kind of character, unstamped, unaddressed. Inside, a single card, its words made by a typewriter that had not been set straight for years. Some debts are best paid under stone. Love did not quite wince. He had been trained to respect both capitals and threats. Purbright read the line, which had the self-satisfaction of a proverb invented at breakfast, and returned the card to its envelope. It bore no fingerprint. It had acquired, though faintly, a smell of furniture polish that had been applied recently to good intentions somewhere. "This arrived today?" he asked. "This morning," Joan said. "Delivered by hand as the postman passed. He is a kindly man." He knocked. "I do not suppose it is malicious. Brayne prefers malice that can sit down properly. But it unsettled me." "Quite understandable," Purbright said. "Malice likes to be helpful. It saves stamps." She tried to smile and succeeded enough for the room's benefit. "I took it for a quotation at first. Then I remembered that proverbs are seldom composed with worn letters." Purbright asked, because the obvious question deserves the dignity of being asked, who, in her acquaintance, possessed a typewriter whose E disliked effort. "The newsletter," Joan said. "You know about that one. The vicarage has an office machine. It takes a brighter view of things. I do not think its E is tired. Mr. Thrips is energetic, a creature of capital letters." Alderman Bligh's secretary, Miss Cole, used to draft statements on a portable of her own. It clicked like a camera. Oh, and the estate agent had a Remington that scattered commas as if they were donations. Aunt disapproved of a Remington in an office where houses were being balanced. "And here?" Purbright's eyes moved carefully towards a modest writing bureau. Its lid stood open, a posture that suggests candor even when no candor is available. The blotter showed a faint rectangle of untanned green where a portable might have lived. In the pigeonholes, various circulars had been encouraged to become history. A very small tin sat near the inkstand, the shape of tins that once held ribbons and now hold buttons last worn by someone dead. "Here," Joan said, following his glance with the trust of tidy people. "We have no typewriter. We did. My husband used one when he sat on the parish housing committee. He took it away when the committee ceased to require housing. He said the ribbon had given up and the carriage had developed sulks. I have been to the attic, Inspector. I found only Christmas decorations that had repented of glitter." Purbright inclined his head. Beside the tin, a sliver of bone. The suggestion, rather than the presence of a paper knife, lay as if a careful hand had tidied it away in a hurry and forgotten to complete the thought. He did not touch it. The maid, if they had one, would find it before lunch and restore it to its drawer. That was the way with parish objects that strayed. "Your aunt's second letter," he said. "She mentioned it to you." "She did," Joan replied. "She said, 'If I cannot arrange other people's consciences, I shall at least arrange my own and leave instructions.'" She smiled. It was not a kind smile, but it was clean. "Did she ever say to whom it was addressed?" "She did not. She enjoyed reticence. It gave her a sense of authorship." Love turned a page of the exercise book. One of the excised places, he noticed, sat within a sequence of entries that had otherwise been meticulous. Collection day totals, small corrective sums. The appearance, once, of a donation represented not as money, but as 3 coats of paint supplied without invoice, estimate recorded as kindness. Immediately after that, a strip was missing. It returned 3 days and 2 entries later with figures that made sense only if one ignored the absence. "Neatly done," Love said. "A parson's knife," Purbright murmured, without looking at the bureau. "Somewhere in Brayne," Joan said with an attempt at lightness. "A parson will be missing his knife. If you find a sermon with a gash in it, that will be the passage. They let the line sit until it had done what labour it could. Purbright closed the exercise book gently, returned the carbon to its place and the place to the book. He asked to borrow the volume overnight if it would not inconvenience morning. Joan hesitated, a precise, practical hesitation that honoured both memory and process, and consented. There would be a sheet to sign. She produced it from a drawer with the hand of a woman who has all the forms required for civic interaction and keeps them clipped. As to the card, she added, when pens had been exchanged with modest gratitude, do you advise ignoring it? I was brought up to ignore everything until it stopped. An admirable method, Purbright said, but only effective when the other party is also well brought up. On the way to the door, he paused where habit led him, at the mantel. Photographs of ordinary victories stood there, the late Mr. Leeming with fish, as men like to be caught. Joan at an urn that had been persuaded to be generous to roses, Edith in a dress whose fabric had been taught rectitude. The frames did not match. This room had not yet advanced to that stage of bereavement. On the stone, near a clock that had found a way to tick without morale, there was a small circular smear, polish, too bright for the rest of the shelf. The space immediately to the left had a paler rectangle where something had lately stood and now did not. It was of the size to have been a frame rather than a typewriter, but rectangles have a way of resembling each other. "Inspector," Joan said. "Forgive me," he replied, leaving the space without an occupation. "The house is tidy. It set me a good example." She returned to the table, where the handbag lay open on its best behaviour. As they went out through the hall, the pillar box across the road released a delivery boy who had been searching his pockets for change. He carried no envelopes now. Love, in passing the umbrella stand, noticed a sliver of paper under its brass ring, very small, transparent as onion skin, caught in the rough of the mat. He bent without bending, detached it, and looked with a face that refused to have seen. The corner bore the faint imprint of a capital E that had given all it could. He placed it on the hall table as one sets down fluff and complimented the mat. On the step, the air smelled faintly of the ordinary. Wash day, damp wool, polish persuading wood to behave. Purbright considered the exercise book with its clean wounds, the onion skin with its meek ferocity, the card with its proverb pretending to be a principle, and the space on the mantel where an object no longer stood. He asked, as though it were a small thing one might remember later on, "Mrs. Leeming, who would have known about your aunt's wish to place the handbag at her feet?" "Only the undertaker," she said, "and I, and Miss Hask, who knows anything that may later require." "Editing, quite," Purbright said. He touched the brim of his hat to her grief because it had performed correctly. Then he went down the path with Love, carrying away, among other unhelpful kindnesses, the sense, small and without volume, of a letter that had once existed and now did not, and of a typewriter that, somewhere between the parish office and a mantel's pale rectangle, had lately grown tired of the letter E. The parish hall had been built with an ambition beyond its means and had reconciled itself to usefulness. Its windows, high and prim, admitted dusk in the form of respectable gloom. A notice board arranged itself on the far wall like a conscience that had learned not to scold. In the centre, a table of such length as to imply procedure bore the solemn apparatus of committee life: jug of water, tumblers that had been taught not to clink, a peppering of pencils sharpened to a clerical severity, and a bell whose services went seldom required and never regretted. Purbright occupied a chair at the end least exposed to honour. He was not a member, which positioned him ideally to observe membership. The parish property committee bore itself with the obstinate grace of a family photograph. Persons connected by what they declined to discuss. Alderman Bligh presided with the practiced forbearance of a man who believed democracy to be an admirable instrument when properly tuned. Miss Hask, editor by profession and temperament, arranged her papers into files that promised narrations later. Mr. Thrip, an ironmonger by trade and occasional donor of nails to God, had the flushed gravity of a man perpetually agreeing with himself. Mrs. Boswell, the organist, wore an expression of long acquaintance with keys that stuck. The vicar, who ranked here as furniture with a vote, sat at the side, a sheaf of minutes clasped to his front, as if they were liturgy temporarily translated. Other lesser officials, Mr. Swithins of estate matters, a churchwarden whose name seemed always to have been mentioned earlier, completed the quorum. Tea had been taken beforehand, thus ensuring there could be no excuse for either candour or haste. "Shall we proceed?" Bligh began, "to the item marked Heritage, Lichgate, Status and Sentiment." He accompanied the words with a glance that spread benevolence like a thin varnish. "We owe this subject a degree of consideration commensurate with its history." The vicar stood and read minutes from years that had not diminished in confidence. He gave the words their due as if they were parishioners who had been waiting patiently in pews. The account recorded appeals, promise of grants, estimations of woodworms' intentions, votes to defer, and votes to reconsider deferral. By the time he reached clarification pending, dusk had moved up the windows to a level ordinarily achieved by penitential seasons. "Thank you," said Bligh, when the minutes had concluded themselves. "These record our diligence. Our diligence, as you know, is not in question." "It is occasionally misinterpreted," observed Mrs. Boswell, who considered misinterpretation a social necessity. Otherwise, people might speak too plainly. A silence, proper and tidy, accepted her point. The Lichgate lay between them like an elderly promise. They discussed it with the wistfulness Brayne reserves for former fiancés, dear in retrospect, inappropriate in the present, and always safely out of reach. Mr. Swithins thought some timbers could be persuaded to repent. Mr. Thrip reported the price of repentance in inches and shillings. The vicar concluded that the diocese took a view and, given encouragement, might take a contribution. Purbright spoke once and in a tone that managed politeness without being accused of it. "Your record-keeping is admirable. Might we, for the sake of completion, remind ourselves of the arrangements then in place regarding cash?" Mr. Thrip reddened into his clerical collar substitute. He had a moral dislike of blunt nouns. "Interim custody," he said, with the air of a man offering linen where others had asked for rope. "During the weeks when collections were less regular than Hope desired, the box was on my counter after vestry closings, so that it could be consolidated before banking. Proper acknowledgments, naturally." "Consolidation is a brave verb," murmured Mrs. Boswell. "It suggests agreement where none existed." "Hymn plates were counted publicly," said the vicar, achieving relief by command. Mrs. Pargeter insisted, out of a principled preference for daylight. That particular insistence, Mrs. Boswell noted, was not universally popular. Numbers acquire a sharpness when observed. "We are all, I think," Bligh interposed gently, "friends to transparency. But not everything needs to be in the newsletter. We do our fellow citizens no service by teaching them to regard process as entertainment. A remark of this quality does not travel directly across a table. It circulates like a draught, which nobody admits has entered. Faces incline, papers settle, and one hears pencils adopt the attitudes of mice. On the contrary, Miss Hask said pleasantly, the newsletter exists precisely to make process tidy enough for public view. Otherwise, process becomes gossip and is dealt with by hearsay, our least sanctified instrument. Bligh smiled and allowed the subject to adopt a different name. "Let us, then, content ourselves with today's proprieties. The inspector," he allowed the title, a soft landing, "graces us with his attention because of the regrettable episode at Mrs. Pargeter's funeral. We cannot aid him by re-arguing old matters." Purbright had no wish to argue anything, old or otherwise, while it still had the power to become a minute. He kept his gaze upon the papers as one looks at a landscape without commitment. I ask only because arithmetic, unlike the rest of us, dislikes being historical. A perfunctory sequence of votes followed upon whether to commission a survey of the gate. The motion sought and received unanimous assent, by which the committee meant that it wished the matter to travel safely into the future, where it could not be seen. When the vote ended, the vicar read aloud a letter he had drafted to the diocesan heritage officer. His prose had practiced being official and would have achieved it had courage not intervened. "We have continued to value this structure," it said, "though circumstances have reminded us of the wisdom of prudence." The phrase made an impression, and then died quietly between the water jug and the bell. Under any other business, the minutes recorded a discussion of draft excluders, hymn-board numerals, and the correct way to acknowledge anonymous acts of generosity without encouraging future anonymity. This last topic produced several sentences that meant well, and a final one from Bligh, asserting that thanks are discouraging when they are mistaken. Miss Hask, who seldom permitted opportunities to go altogether unreported, inquired whether, purely for accuracy, pastorals might be advised when the committee took decisions affecting contributions from those who liked to read themselves thanked. Bligh answered as if setting a lesson. The Parish Property Committee acts on behalf of all, under God and the PCC. The newsletter informs rather than interrogates. "We inform better when we are not obliged to infer," Miss Hask said, and wrote down something that might have been a recipe or a threat. At the far end, Mr. Thrip shuffled papers with the ill-concealed impatience of a man who wished to return to his shop before the afternoon made nails into luxuries. He had brought with him a receipt book of the sort that prefers ledger paper to air, and kept setting it straight upon the table as if it were inclined to morals. The book bore a stain at the corner where oil or furniture polish had once insisted on proximity. Polishers in Brayne, Purbright reflected, enjoyed committees. They learnt quickly how to sit through them. The meeting adjourned itself with a modest flourish and a rustle of apologies. Chairs backed away from duty with little sighs. People did not exactly stand. They allowed standing to occur. The vicar collected minutes with the protectiveness of a man who had once seen paper become a weapon. Mr. Swithins sought his hat with reproach. Hats, like meetings, always ended somewhere other than where they began. Mrs. Boswell wrapped her shawl around a grievance that would keep. Bligh, with faultless procedure, invited any who wished to speak further to do so elsewhere. Purbright made no move to depart. Miss Hask rearranged her files with the slow accuracy of someone choosing which truths could be left unsupervised. When the last of the officious had drifted into the foyer, she approached Purbright with a paper folded upon itself with disdain. The paper had been typed with confidence. A title stood at its head, "Appeal suspended pending clarification." The lines beneath performed the small dance by which statements avoid collision with facts. "I prepared this," she said, "in the weeks when the fund became largely theoretical. It was never distributed. We were advised that clarification was best pursued in silence." Purbright took the sheet. The typeface was familiar in the way that parish faces are familiar, but the E, once anemic, had regained some color. The ribbon, at least, had been refreshed. Yet the spacing, the slight sway of capitals, the modest shift of the R after a comma, these were unchanged. Someone, he thought, had altered ink, not conduct. "You see?" Miss Hask said, and she was not asking. "I do," he said. "A statement ready to speak but asked to think again." "Precisely." His eye moved to the foot of the page. In a corner, someone had placed, as a printer's private joke or a future footnote, a tiny notation in pencil. "Draft retained." Beneath, erased to timidity, an initial, possibly hers, possibly a colleague's, had left a ghost. The paper retained a faint scent that had nothing to do with dust. It was the agreeable, diminished smell of polish, the sort that lingers around well-behaved furniture and well-practiced restraint. Who decided not to distribute? He asked. The committee, she said, by which I mean the atmosphere. And who typed it? His voice carried no journey. In Brayne, such questions were invitations to a kind of civility. I did on the newsletters machine, she replied. The ribbon had just been changed. You perceive the difference. Everyone enjoys new clarity until they notice what they can read. They stood companionably and silent while the hall reacquired its evening. Through the door came the faint sound of Bligh in the foyer, deploying phrases about progress that would flatter those who did not expect to see any. Mr. Thripp's laugh, brief and metallic, struck the ear like an instrument tuning itself to an incorrect pitch. Somewhere, a kettle considered work and postponed it. Your editorial sense, Purbright said, has preserved a number of code books. Idleness is responsible for more preservation than virtue, she said. I had not the energy to throw things away. He folded the circular with a care that made the gesture appear official. May I keep this? You may, she said. It will save you the trouble of asking me later to pretend I remember it. As they walked together towards the foyer, she paused to replace a chair that had strayed from its line. Chairs in church halls, like facts, look untidy when not disciplined. Her hand brushed the chair back. The polish there yielded a small brightness that admitted its recent application. In the foyer, the committee parted itself into agreeable fragments. Good evenings, like pennies, were exchanged. At the door, Bligh inclined himself to correctness. A useful session, Inspector. One must not be bullied by retrospection. We shall, I am confident, find an honourable way forward. Choice prefers honourable ways, Purbright said, which passed because it sounded like agreement. Outside, dusk completed its occupation. Across the yard, the lich gate held its silhouette like a figure remembering a dance. Love, who had been in the corner with the jug and had learned more there than the jug, joined the inspector. He glanced once back into the hall, where the bells sat immaculate and the pencils lay at attention. Did you see, he said, the counting plates stacked against the cupboard in their cloth sleeves? 3 of them. Mrs. Pargeter used to count them in public. I did, Purbright said. They don't look as if they've been counted lately. Love nodded toward the paper in Purbright's hand. Different ribbon? Yes, said Purbright. Same hand. They walked beneath the gate because the path insisted. The boards above carried the day's thin damp without complaint. On one of the uprights, near the lower joint, there was a smear that might have been nothing at all. Purbright touched it with a forefinger and brought it away clean, then held it under what remained of the sky. It made no mark he could show to anyone. It might have been candle grease once, or polish now. The gate had learned to accept coatings. The parish had learned to apply them. They went on. At the corner, Purbright stopped as if the air had spoken. He opened the circular again and held it by its top edge. At the bottom margin, newly visible where the fold had quit its habit, the typescript revealed a single extra space before the word pending. On the Coffin letter there had been 2. A person's thumb finds the same place on a machine, he reflected, as a habit finds the same place in a sentence, unless a ribbon has been changed and a conscience refreshed. He folded the paper again, in precisely the way it had first been folded, and put it away. The hall behind them settled for the night, chairs practicing their patience, minutes acquiring their burial. In the hedge, a blackbird rehearsed a phrase it could not improve. Purbright considered the difference between ink that darkens and lives that do not. And somewhere in that thought, a small question, perfectly house-trained, came to sit. Who in Brayne had learned lately to change ribbons without changing what was being said? The vicar received Inspector Purbright in a study furnished by inherited sermons and uncomfortable chairs. Both had grown stout with endurance. The room's air, reluctant to circulate, carried a faint ecclesiastical musk of paper and wool, with a lighter top note of lavender applied at intervals to repel despair. Books lined 3 walls in the posture of long suffering. They wore their dust as clergy wear collars, part symbol, part restraint. An orrery of paperweights orbited the desk, a glass dome containing a dried edelweiss, a little brass handbell missing its clapper, and a smooth stone stamped with the word peace in characters distressed on purpose. The vicar rose from behind his desk as though it had ordained him. "Inspector, you find me at my most approachable, which is to say, overwhelmed." Purbright, who knew that approachability resides chiefly in tone, inclined his head. Sergeant Love occupied the least unfortunate chair, with the care of a large man attempting not to form a theological statement by sitting. "We shall not be long," Purbright said. "You are patient enough with minutes without contributing to them." "I've always admired your kindness to paper," the vicar returned, and then, because kindness to paper is seldom an end in itself, he added, "You will, I imagine, wish to speak of matters that once belonged to the Lichgate." "Matters that still do," said Purbright, "even when they believe otherwise." The vicar's study had developed a habit of confessing on behalf of its owner. On a side table sat a portable typewriter in a case, its straps crossed like fingers praying for discretion. Beside it, half concealed by a hymn book too large for humility, lay a ribbon tin whose penciled label read, "Spare, not reliable." Purbright's glance met these objects in the manner of a man passing known graves without salute. "In those trying weeks," the vicar said, prefacing courage with apology, "I borrowed Miss Hask's committee typewriter from time to time in order to compose drafts. Drafts of appeals, drafts of apologies, drafts of what I might have said had I been equal to saying it. One discovers that the Lord's parables did not anticipate committees." "Drafts," Purbright said, giving the word a seat. "Some were typed?" "Yes." The vicar's hands made a small intercession over an invisible keyboard. "Miss Hask's machine is a faithful thing, only the letter E tires easily. I armed myself with onion skin. When one fails to act, one compensates with stationery." "None were sent," Purbright said. "I lack the courage." The vicar smiled in that private way pastors adopt when forgiving themselves with reluctance. Or perhaps the accuracy. "I prefer to err by omission. Commission, I've noticed. Breeds committee." Love allowed a sound, shaped like sympathy, to be mistaken for it. Purbright, not a guest of the sentiment, watched the vicar's eyes, those small windows in which men keep the reluctances they later call memory. "You did not place, then," Purbright said, "the letter in Mrs. Pargeter's coffin?" "No," the vicar replied at once, and in the way of men who rehearse denials because they fear they may need them for other matters. His tone contained all the truth he could presently afford. "I cannot imagine doing so, Inspector. I've put many things where they do not belong, my trust, my optimism, but not, I think, letters in coffins. One should not require the dead to carry one's correspondences." "Quite," said Purbright. On the shelf behind the vicar's shoulder, a box file labelled in that exact parish hand, upright in blue pencil, announced itself. "Lichgate, Archive." It stood with sacerdotal reluctance, as if already practicing the objection it hoped to raise. The vicar noticed Purbright noticing it and, with the air of producing bread and wine in circumstances unsanctioned, drew it down. "I've tried," he said, "to keep our consciences as tidy as our cupboards." He opened the lid with a flinching tenderness one accords to pets that have learned biting. Inside, papers lay in chronological submission, minutes printed for recitation, circulars dampened by caution, receipts that had taken vows of celibacy. There was also, bound with a ribbon whose optimism had faded, a stack of statements that had never been published. "We shall begin," the vicar suggested. "With what consoles? The receipts." He produced one for timber never purchased. The invoice proclaimed a merchant from a town 50 miles off, thus guaranteeing virtue by distance, thanking the parish for the order that had not, finally, been fulfilled. Beside it, pinned like a footnote, a letter explained that certain beams, being older than anticipated, were not advisable for rural gateways where weather is doctrinal. The return of deposit had been acknowledged with relief, yet the deposit received voucher remained, debit without its partner. And here, the vicar said, fingers selecting gilt by thickness, a promissory note from Mr. Thrip's ironmongery, by which I mean, of course, hardware, undertaking to supply wood preservative at discount, payable on receipt of grant funding from the diocese. A pause. It is cancelled in pencil. I confess that is a tone of voice I distrust in accountancy. Purbright took the paper. The cancellation line was a neat diagonal, respectable as a sash. Above it, in Mr. Thrip's tidy capitals, energetic even when contrite, the words "paid in kind" had been inserted. There followed a parenthesis. 3 coats on north style. See estimate. It was difficult to deny that a man had painted something somewhere. It was equally difficult to applaud arithmetic that preferred brackets. Tides, the vicar said, folding the promissory note onto itself as if it might reconsider. Mr. Thrip is merely tidal in his repayments. One should not begrudge the sea its motion. When did Tides, Purbright asked, become anonymous? The vicar brightened briefly, relieved to be allowed a parable. Ah, yes, the thank yous. It is true we acknowledged donations without names, an attempt at modesty. We did not wish to invite competition in public virtue. Competition in private rectitude is to be preferred. Not preferred, the vicar said, but less exhausting. He removed next a letter on heavy paper bearing Edith Pargeter's spare signature. The typing was emphatic, and even the E neither shy nor vainglorious. Miss Hask's machine had been in a better hour. The letter ran along a narrow lane between rebuke and counsel. Dear Vicar, the vicar read, and the words seemed to redden his hands. You must stop shielding a gentleman whose accountancy is devotional rather than accurate. If he wishes to tithe, he should say so. He is welcome to his ointments, which I dare say preserve wood, but mathematics has its own sacraments. Please proceed to daylight. Yours, in arithmetic, E. Pargeter. Silence went to work, gentle but insistent. The edelweiss in the glass dome continued to be dead in an orderly fashion. Love studied his shoe as a responsible man studies weather. Purbright replaced the letter in the file with a care that did not flatter it. She spoke and wrote thus, the vicar said, folding his fingers into one another as if there might be sanctuary there. Bluntly. Her bluntness was a kindness to other people's dithering. Mine, I fear, can be discouraging in other directions. You received this when? Purbright asked. A week before the committee decided to suspend the appeal. I drafted in response a statement. He leafed and found a half sheet of onion skin, its top left corner bent into a small white horn. It said that we recognized the tidal nature of certain obligations and wished to regularize them. I could not send it. Regularize is such an impersonal verb. It makes sinners equipment. Yet you typed it, Purbright said, on Miss Hask's machine. I did. He smiled at the memory, as at a misdemeanor one has ceased trying to correct. The tired E was almost a mercy. It suggested a humility I could not generate. Purbright's eyes had wandered from paper to place. A faint, paler rectangle marked the blotter's green where a portable typewriter had recently stood. The desk's edge showed a brightness not quite congruent with neglect. Polish had been applied in a hurry, not buffed to completion, the shape of discretion when summoned late. On the shelf beside the box file, a tin of ribbon lurked under a tract about stewardship. The tract had been used, the ribbon had not. You have been changing ribbons, Purbright said without emphasis. I had hoped, the vicar admitted, to make legible what could not be made brave. I wished to type something final. Alas, when I hear my own sentences, my verbs resign. Did you, by any chance, draft a circular, appeal suspended pending clarification? The vicar's smile betrayed recognition in the way a small dog betrays biscuits. Indeed. Miss Hask improved it and then, rightly, I think, declined to release it. Clarification is less effective when announced. Do you keep your drafts? In a drawer reserved for guilty hope. He opened a shallow compartment. Inside lay a confessional miscellany. Carbons clipped to nothing, a small coil of onion skin, envelopes addressed to nobody, a list of phrases that had not obtained permission to be said, a season of renewal, prudence in Thanksgiving, reconciliation of figures. At the bottom, folded twice, a single sheet bore the familiar exhaustion of the letter E. It read, without salutation, "Reopen the subscription fund." Purbright raised an eyebrow that stopped elegantly short of accusation. "This." "A draft," the vicar said quickly. "Only a draft. I thought, since Mrs. Pargeter urged daylight, that a symbolic act might restore confidence. We could perhaps invite new subscriptions at a meeting where the old figures would be gently shown." "And you discarded the idea?" "I did," the vicar replied, and added a silence too long for comfort. I had not the constitutional fortitude for fresh history. Purbright slipped the sheet back. Its edges had acquired the delicacy of paper that has been handled by intention and then abandoned to conscience. He closed the drawer and asked for the favor of examining the remainder of the box file. The vicar consented with the slow nod of a man giving away birds. There were receipts for hymn-board numerals, set of 10s, 2 missing, a memorandum regarding draft excluders, approved in principle, rejected in practice, and a printed note about a grant application never sent. On one typed page, a line had been struck through in pencil, the same tidy diagonal that had cancelled Mr. Thripp's promissory. The line read, "We wish to thank those anonymous benefactors whose modesty equals their—" The sentence never reached its noun. "Anxiety's burrow," the vicar said, massaging the bridge of his nose as if persuasion could be rubbed in. "I fear I've been guilty of a pastoral arithmetic. It adds kindness and subtracts accuracy until the total looks Christian." "Christianity," Purbright said mildly, "has not always been so forgiving towards sums." The vicar looked for sanctuary and found an uncomfortable chair. "You must be patient with me, Inspector. You have police, I have God. You both require a statement of account at the end." "Both, I suspect," said Purbright, "are prepared to accept clarity in lieu of eloquence." At which the vicar reached for the edelweiss. He held the glass dome as if it might have acquired a function beyond its two, to suffocate and to display. "This was in the house when I arrived," he said irrelevantly. "My predecessor believed it symbolized fidelity at altitude. I find it a warning about thin air." Love, marshalling his voice into a straight line, ventured, "Mr. Thripp's note, cancelled in pencil. Who made the mark?" "I," the vicar said. "At Mr. Thripp's suggestion." He smiled with penitent bravery. "He is an impatient man. He dislikes ambiguity, even more than he dislikes being found out. He brought me the note and the pencil and said, 'Let us regularize, Vicar.' It seemed briefly noble." "Did you inform the committee?" Purbright asked. "I informed the atmosphere," the vicar said. "The committee was not in the mood for nouns." Purbright closed the box file. It seemed lighter now, as objects do when their contents have been made to walk about the room. He thanked the vicar for his candor in a tone that neither blessed nor mocked it. "One last question," he added, as if remembering a hymn after the recessional. "The vicarage extension, the telephone, who uses it when committees break into fragments?" "Members," the vicar said. "Also their preparers and their consolers. The line is familiar to the parish the way a kettle is familiar. On wet evenings it becomes a sacrament." "There was a call from it," Purbright said, "to the undertaker, late, asking when the chapel might be quiet enough for last thoughts." The vicar's face performed the old rite of compunction. a phrase urged upon me by an impulse, he confessed, a little too readily. But not by me, Inspector. I was, that evening, undertaking last thoughts of my own about a sermon on stewardship. I concluded that sermons cannot be improved by telephones. He stood then as though his person could announce adjournment. Purbright and Love rose with that slow civility practiced by men who prefer not to be remembered entering or leaving. At the door, Purbright's hand paused on the latch. The wood beneath it shone in a fresh crescent where polish had lately laboured. Within the sheen a thin track had formed, a pencil line rubbed and then half remembered, just the width one might expect from a paper knife testing its sharpness before choosing a page. On the sill below, in the angle where dust is accustomed to make its claims, lay a single loop of black ribbon that had escaped its tin and then its purpose. It curled upon itself politely, like a sentence reconsidered. Purbright looked at it and did not point. "Should you discover," he said, "that any of your drafts have wandered into practice, perhaps you will be so good as to let me know." "I shall," the vicar promised, and reached to straighten the box file's label as if that, at least, could be certain. They stepped into the corridor where church air lives, a different species from domestic air, more obedient, less curious. Behind them, the study settled to its usual devotions: inherited sermons, uncomfortable chairs, receipts for timber never purchased, and the humble industry of a man attempting to balance mercy against arithmetic. Outside, the dusk received them with the equanimity peculiar to parsonages, which believe any departure might be an arrival in disguise. As they crossed the vicarage lawn, Purbright glanced back through the study window. The vicar had lifted the typewriter's case and was replacing it more carefully than necessary, aligning strap to strap until prayer and habit were indistinguishable. It was not the act that proposed the small shift. It was the little tap he gave the case at the end, a tap of reassurance or farewell, one could not say, before he turned to the desk and, after a moment's ritual hesitation, extinguished the lamp, leaving the boxed machine looking devout under its label, "Spare, not reliable." Mr. Thripp's ironmongery smelt of remedies that had learned respectable names: turpentine that pretended to be linseed's cousin, varnish with a Sunday manna, oils that cured everything except the reasons things squeaked. The counter had acquired a burnish from years of arguments settled in pennies. Behind it rose shelves of boxes whose contents were not secrets so much as small certainties: screws, hinges, brackets, which the town bought whenever its sense of order found itself winded. Thripp himself appeared from the back with the energy of a man who had been tacitly consulting himself and had decided in favor. He wore an apron that preserved the shape of reform. His face, when it encountered Purbright, prepared itself for balance sheets that talked instead of adding. "Inspector, Sergeant, you are civil to call," he said, dislodging a handcloth from a nail as if to prove neatness could always find a use. "If it's about draft excluders, your best is the felt. Rubber perishes." "We came," Purbright said, "on a matter that once, for a time, rested here." "Rested," Thripp repeated as if endorsing a catalogue. "Is the word, the funds box?" "Yes. Under my counter for a fortnight's interim custody. There was a panic concerning woodworm, unnecessary, in my view, during which it was judged prudent to remove temptations from the vestry. Auditors, I realize, take a dim view of entomology. They prefer numbers that do not have legs." Love examined a display of tap washers with a carefully unscholarly air. Policemen adopt in shops owned by people whose wives sing with their wives. Purbright allowed his hand to rest upon the counter where the box would have sat. The wood was smooth in a particular oval that matched the idea of coins being encouraged to decide. "Every penny," Thripp continued, "was returned. Eventually. Through discounts applied to invoices and supplies rendered at cost or below. There's an honest way through most detours if you take a tape measure with you. Brayne understands that. One often finds oneself ahead after a while, simply by not insisting on money speaking when work will. It must have been noisy for arithmetic. Purbright said mildly. Arithmetic likes to be talked to, Thrip replied, taking the remark as compliment. It is only offended by poetry. Mrs. Pargeter, the name exited his mouth with the respectful labor of a loaded trolley. Didn't like the route, no, demanded exact restitution, demanded it in figures preferably witnessed by others. She kept private tallies because, she said, the committee preferred narratives to numbers. I told her narratives are what people can bear to hear, sums being tiresome when one is trying to sleep. She said figures help you sleep if you do not owe anyone anything. She was rarely wrong, provided someone else did the arithmetic first. Private tallies, Purbright repeated. In an exercise book. In something with lines, Thrip said. She made the lines do what she wanted. She would call in of an evening and inquire, very civilly, whether my conscience had obtained a receipt. I'd say my conscience didn't sign for goods. It only polished the counter, but I gave her what she came for. She would count coins as if they feared her and put them into columns that did. A bell on the door performed a modest caricature of welcome and then stood aside. A customer came in with a hinge that had divorced itself from a kitchen cupboard on grounds of incompatibility. Thrip advised a more generous application of screws and sentiment, wrote a figure in his book with numbers that sat up straight, and sent the man away, believing he had repaired more than oak. The shop resettled into its quiet. On the evening before Mrs. Pargeter's funeral, Purbright said, when domestic commerce had retreated, "Were you at your counter?" "Between 6 and 8, Thrip said. A man in trade does not spare his evenings for fear eternity will be short. Why? Because someone used the vicarage extension at 21 past 8 to ask when the chapel would be quiet enough for last thoughts. Mr. Vass has a tidy log." Thrip nodded as one nods to a well-cut mortise. "Committees like telephones. It's cheaper than facing one another in good light. I was not at the vicarage. If I had been, I shouldn't have said last thoughts in a shopkeeper's voice. It invites haggling." "You saw anything of the vestry that night?" Love asked, still studying washers, his voice capable of lifting only what it needed to lift. "I saw Mrs. Boswell leave the vestry," Thrip said promptly. "About 20 to 8, I'd guess. She had a manila envelope and a hymn book, held it like a shield. Which does the same thing in Brayne. Organist's arms, very straight. The hymn was, 'If my ear can be trusted from 40 yards, nearer, my God, to thee.' She hums with an authority theology might envy." "A hymn of either taste or irony," Purbright suggested. "I didn't say which," Thrip returned, pleased to have described music without making it personal. She went across toward the vicarage at a pace that said she was not late so much as other people were early. Purbright's face did not alter. It occasionally suggested that altering one's face made the truth feel obliged to do the same. And Mrs. Pargeter's preference, if any, for envelopes. "Stout," said Thrip once. She believed in weight, said there was nothing so disheartening as flimsy paper attempting to be moral. "If you cannot afford heavy paper," she said, "you can at least ensure your letters contain something." She was old-fashioned in the right places. I do not object to right places. The counter had, near its right-hand end, a dark polish the shape of a cash box that likes to be understood. Purbright's finger passed over it once and left no change. Behind the counter, the till produced, unasked, a small squeak as if remembering that honesty has moving parts. The sound made Thrip glance automatically towards it. He gave the drawer a little knock with his knuckle, the sort of correction men administer when they wish a thing to behave without learning why. "Your typewriter," Purbright said, looking towards the back office, where a doorway admitted the impression of more shelves and, farther in, the suggestion of a chair that had been sat in by consecutive afternoons. "You possessed one at the time of the fund?" "I didn't do," Thrip said. "Back there." He waved a hand that had inherited the idea of generosity from ancestors. "A Remington, bright temperament. The letters spring to attention, particularly the E. You can tell an honest machine by its E. A timid one suggests cowardice, An overworked one suggests committees. May we? Purbright asked, the courtesy itself a permission. In the back, Thrip said, already moving with a bustle that implied there could be nothing in an ironmonger's back room to interest the police except stock. He led them past a regiment of paraffin cans showing their shoulders and into a little office where a desk had taught itself to exist by bearing weight. The typewriter sat on a blotter whose corners 4 generations of notices had pressed down. The E on a discarded sheet, left in the carriage with the obstinacy that suggests a letter would like to be proofread, was brisk and young. Even in the ghost of its imprint across the second page, the character stood up straight, as if summoned for inspection. Purbright depressed the key gently. It responded in the affirmative. He could, without difficulty, imagine it striking through onion skin and leaving its impression on whatever lay meekly beneath. He had wherewithal to imagine several such things now. "You keep carbons?" Love asked. "For invoices," Thrip said. "Merchants like to remember what they regret. I keep my own copies because other people forget theirs. Ribbons. Here." He opened a drawer and produced a tin that had once held something edible and now held compliance. Beneath it lay a small stack of manila envelopes, the economical size suitable for minutes not meant to be lost and letters not yet brave enough for stamps. The top envelope bore a faint grey smudge near its flap, the ghost of polish from a hand that kept counters honest. "Supplies for the vicarage too?" Purbright asked, as if the thought had come for the sake of conversation. "They fetch envelopes when the office forgets itself," Thrip said, "and I keep hymnboard numerals because the church's set refuses to multiply. We all help one another in Brayne, particularly with anything that refuses." In the corner stood a small moral broom. At its feet lay a sliver of onion skin the size of a redeemable doubt. Love, who had cultivated the knack of noticing without stooping, managed to put his toe beneath it and draw it into reach. A capital E showed on the translucent square, firm and uncompromised. He set it on the desk as one sets down a useless coin that may yet be of interest to a collector. "You can see," Thrip said, "that my letters do not tire. When they do, I change the ribbon. I do not wait for Providence to darken nouns." They returned to the shop where the light had altered its opinion about afternoon. A woman wanted tacks suitable for upholstery and advice about whether her husband should be allowed to deploy them. Thrip provided both, the latter in the form of small practical discouragements. When she had gone, he turned back to Purbright with the right amount of apology for commerce's interruptions. "You will wish to ask," he said, "whether, during the time the box was with me, any improper borrowings occurred. They did not. There were, how shall I put it, convenient transitions. Money became goods, became labor, became gratitude. If any of those elements sulked, I stood them a penny. It came right in the end. Mrs. Pargeter would not agree. She did not like ends. She liked proofs." "Proofs do not keep long in air," Purbright said. "No," Thrip agreed. "That is why envelopes are so beloved." He wrote out a receipt for Purbright, a dozen 3-inch nails, purchased as camouflage, and tore it off with the businesslike brutality that is honesty's final luxury. The type at the top, Thrip Hardware, had been stamped on the printed sheet years ago and had acquired a mild halo from damp. He wrote the item in a hand one could store for winter. "There," he said, "it is always well to be able to say one has paid, even if the reason for it wishes to be mysterious." On the street, the nails felt useful in Purbright's pocket. Usefulness sometimes made company for thought. Love slid the receipt into his notebook with a fold that suggested he might want its edges to remember things. "He's certain of his E," Love said. "Brisk. Young. Our tired fellow in the Coffin letter will have been elsewhere." "Elsewhere," Purbright said, "is populous." They walked a few paces under the sort of weather that believes it is not really there. In the ironmongery window, a pyramid of polished tins reflected the street in the modest, battered way tins do. The topmost showed an oval smear where someone's thumb had tested the lid. Above them, a small cardboard notice, hand-lettered, announced, "Varnish, new clear." The E in new stood up with the energy of beginners. "Nearer, my God, to thee," Love said, remembering the organist's arms. Odd choice to hum, leaving a vestry if one wishes to seem untheatrical. Or very apt, Purbright said. Depends whether one is ascending or hiding. They had reached the corner when a small, obedient thought came and sat at Purbright's heel. He turned the receipt over and examined the carbon's bloom upon its back. The E in 3-inch appeared twice, and both times with a vigor that admitted no doubt. He put the paper away and looked up the street where the church's roofline kept its posture against polity and seasons alike. If Mrs. Boswell hummed "Nearer" from the parish hymnal, he said half to himself, she has a better memory than the book. Our edition omitted it years ago to discourage shipwrecks in taste. She must have carried a different hymnal or a different intention. Love did not answer. He found it prudent to let certain sentences keep their own company. Behind them, inside the shop, the till emitted a small squeak, contrite and unchanged. It sounded, to Purbright's ear, exactly like a conscience, hoping oil might be mistaken for apology. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the nails settle against his palm, brisk, young, uncomplicated, while, quite without consulting him, a doubt about hymns sung in the wrong key made a home at the edge of his mind and waited, politely, to be useful. Mrs. Boswell received Purbright not so much in the organ loft as upon her territory. The loft kept a parish kind of altitude, high enough to see conduct, low enough to overhear it, and had learned to store both music and grievances without being accused of favoritism. The instrument itself, a conscientious contraption of pipes that refused to be theatrical, stood with the air of being ready to submit to instruction for so long as instruction remained readable. On a shelf behind, hymnals, anthem scores, and a rolled-up poster for a harvest festival that had been postponed indefinitely leaned together like relatives who had agreed to dislike the same person. "Inspector," Mrs. Boswell said, turning on the bench in that careful arc by which an organist preserves dignity and skirts the swell pedal, "and Sergeant, I'm delighted to oblige the civil power. Do tread softly on the pedals. They remember." Love, who regarded instruments with the respect he reserved for locomotives and hot water, arranged himself against the rail. Purbright settled on the end of the bench, far enough not to be mistaken for a stop, close enough to be involved. "I am told," Mrs. Boswell began, "that the town finds itself, yet again, tempted to be interested in a gate. Gates are not designed to be interesting. They are designed to be useful. When they fail at utility, they attempt charm and then grow expensive. I prefer my expenses to declare themselves. We are looking," Purbright said, "for the places where expense was declared and where it was only implied." She gave him, from the thin shelf of the loft's light, the look one gives to students who pronounce entire doctrines by way of preface. "You will have spoken to those for whom accounts are an occupation. I am a woman of enumeration only because choirs need it and pews, being democratic, resist it. I do not love Mrs. Pargeter's mathematical charity. It robbed generosity of its romance. People give better when they are permitted to be mistaken about how much. Mrs. Pargeter," Purbright said, "believed daylight improves sums." "Daylight improves nothing," Mrs. Boswell replied. "It merely obliges furniture to polish itself. You may tell Miss Hask I said so." "It will be in the newsletter," Purbright said, "with or without polish." Mrs. Boswell tapped the music stand with a fingernail whose sound suggested an endorsed principle. "You have come, I suppose, about envelopes. They are to this town what morals are to other places. Omnipresent, folded, and seldom stamped. I did tidy the vestry on the evening you mean. Tidy is the vicar's word. By it, he intends that I took disorder into custody and advised it not to reoffend." There were 2 envelopes on the table when I began. One contained my choir rotas and a stern note to tenors who breathed democratically. The other belonged to Miss Hask and needed no encouragement. "You carried a manila envelope and a hymn book," Purbright said. "Mr. Thrip observed you leaving. He identified the hymn as 'Nearer, my God, to Thee.'" Mrs. Boswell allowed her mouth the movement that accompanied an unplayed dissonance. "Mr. Thrip has a hardware ear. I was humming Mendelssohn, softly, for fear of encouraging sentiment among the lamp oil. 'Nearer' is not in our book. The editor took a view upon shipwreck. It is, however, in mine." She lifted, from the pile to her left, a hymnal bound in a brown that believed in leather without the ability to afford it. Between 2 pages, a pasted leaf had been inserted by a hand impatient with clerical deletions. The small figures showed words that had survived their eviction from public print. "You found," Purbright encouraged, "the vestry otherwise uninhabited." "Uninhabited by intention," Mrs. Boswell said. "The verger had migrated to the boiler with his conscience, and Miss Hask had removed herself to interrogate the notice board, which, being glassed, cannot answer back." "The manila envelope contained what you have said," Purbright said. "You will not be surprised that an envelope of similar shape made its way to the coffin, and thence to conversation." "I have never put anything into a coffin except music," Mrs. Boswell said. Her tone did not require belief. It required decency. I do not suppose Edith would have objected to music, provided it was accounted. For in the minutes Purbright produced, with apology, the phrase that had lately wandered across several tables, "Reopen the subscription fund. Does it speak to you?" "It does not," Mrs. Boswell said. "Not in the way it wishes. Some gates are better left decorative. A reopened fund is only an invitation to old quarrels to become current." "Quarrels do enjoy interest," Purbright observed. "Choirs enjoy it more," she returned. "The tenors I threaten to reform have learned to inhale where others are attempting salvation. I admit to a sternness in their regard. I leave gates to men who think about timber and forget about weather." "You are not," Love said with the straightness of a shelf, "fond of Mrs. Pargeter's public counting." "I do not despise public counting," Mrs. Boswell said, "so long as it is done by attractive people who are grateful. Mrs. Pargeter was exact when she might have been exemplary. She preferred to balance columns rather than faces. I'm not certain Christianity agrees." "Miss Hask," Purbright prompted, "once threatened a special edition naming those with elastic pockets." Mrs. Boswell's mouth did something nearly charitable. "She did. We stood at that ridiculous notice board and rehearsed indignation. I urged her to print and be damned. She has a journalist's stomach and a parishioner's digestion." Edith restrained her. "We will balance columns," she said, "and leave faces to their own arrangements." I thought it a barren victory, but it kept tea parties alive who would otherwise have died of truth. "You will forgive a practical inquiry," Purbright said. "Alderman Bligh's name, when lich gates are discussed, refuses to stay decorous. He paid, I am told, quietly, for the plaque." Mrs. Boswell lowered her gaze to a register whose notes had once bitten and learned thereafter to let go. "He did," she said. "He ordered the engraving. I saw the paper when it came. He chose a restrained script. Men in public life often dislike serifs. They suggest personalities that can be named. The bill, however, being a bill, found its way into the parish account. The treasurer signed it with the air of being encouraged to be grateful. I expressed a view. I was informed that gratitude improves cash flow." "To whom was the bill addressed?" Purbright asked. "To the parish of St. Mark," she said. The envelope was posted to the vicarage and opened at the PCC meeting with a gasp people reserve for expensive kindness. Alderman Bligh smiled in a way that resembled responsibility from a distance. "I have nothing against being thanked. I dislike being used as scenery for it." "Do you keep," Purbright said, "records of choir rotas which are typed?" "It would help me to understand which machines are asked to serve which virtues." Mrs. Boswell permitted herself a ripple of amusement, like a scale that expects to resolve. The rotas are typed presently on the vicarage machine when Miss Hask's is sulking. Miss Hask's E sheds its enthusiasm in warm weather. The vicar's persists. When neither will oblige, I resort to pen and a prayer against smudges. She swiveled slightly and drew from the shelf a thin sheaf clipped together with choir mistress economy. The top copy displayed names, dates, and instructions. Breathe politely, rendered in a type that refused to tire. On the second sheet, the ghost of the first had impressed itself faintly, the E, even and dependable. Purbright saw, projected through, the tired vowel he had come to recognize elsewhere. It did not appear. Whatever had been typed here had been typed by the brighter instrument. "You never borrowed Miss Hask's machine," Purbright said. "I have borrowed Miss Hask's sense," Mrs. Boswell returned. "I do not covet her typewriter. Its vowels suffer from scruples." The loft, being accustomed to rehearsal, accepted this as an ending. Purbright rose. Love unfolded himself in a way that diffused apology into air. They thanked Mrs. Boswell, who received gratitude with the grace of a woman who knew what it cost when expressed in public. On their way to the ladder, she permitted herself, as if finding a place for it among the stops, one last observation. "Alderman Bligh," she said, "paid for the engraving quietly. I will not pretend it was ignoble." But when the engraver's bill arrived, it was made out to the parish, not the alderman. There was, for a time, a penciled notation on the corner, 2 initials in a hand that enjoyed authority and erasing. The initials later ceased to be visible. It must be a comfort to have a robust rubber. "Do you recall the engraver?" Purbright asked. "Pelham and Bright," she said. "They do ecclesiastical capitals with reluctance and prices with charm." Purbright thanked her. He was almost at the ladder. She stopped him once more, as if a small chorale had insisted. "If you reopen the fund, Inspector, do not allow it to be sung about. Money sung about never arrives, and what does arrive remembers the melody when it should remember the sum." They descended. From the nave, the loft looked like an idea laid across the church at an unfortunate angle. In the chancel, a shaft of weather tried and failed to appear sincere. The vestry door, half open, presented its usual view of half-hung cassocks and a cupboard that could not decide between sanctity and polish. The air had that ecclesiastical, polished smell which suggests recent tidying and unhurried repentance. Love, who had a use for cupboards just then, peered in. A paraphernalia of choir machinery, paper clamps, soft pencils that had learned to obey, a metronome that ticked only for authority, sat in their habitual queue. On the vestry table lay Mrs. Boswell's manila envelope, the corner turned under as if it had hesitated about doctrine. Next to it, a thin slip of paper narrower than a hymn verse, printer's tissue, carried the faint reverse impression of letters. Parish of St. Mark. Plaque. Balance due. In the corner, a penciled notation had been rubbed nearly entirely away. The lower curve of a capital remained, stubborn as a conscience that will not leave its outline. Perhaps a B, perhaps nothing. Purbright did not touch it. He looked, instead, at the hymnal Mrs. Boswell had left propped against the shelf below. A pasted leaf showed nearer, my God, to thee, in a Victorian face that had outlived respectability. In the margin a small, neat hand, the kind that improves music by moving it nearer to counting, had marked, beside the third verse, a discreet cross. He closed the book and set it back. Then he lifted his eyes to the loft and found Mrs. Boswell regarding the nave with the unromantic affection of women who provide order to other people's emotions. "I do dislike arithmetic," she called down mildly. "It removes the tune." "Sometimes," Purbright returned. "It reveals it." They walked out into the yard under the lich gate that insisted upon silhouette. On the inner post, a recent brightness had appeared. a half-moon where a polished rag had lifted grime too zealously and left the wood momentarily ahead of its neighbours. The plaque, obedient in its recess, offered names that had not yet learned to weather. Purbright looked at the lettering and imagined the rubbing that would produce its ghost on tissue, the very tissue lying unclaimed on the vestry table. He did not frame this as evidence. He allowed it the hum of a dominant note waiting for resolution. Love, who took his cues from smaller music, said nothing. His gaze travelled once back to the organ loft, where an arm reached lazily to close the swell box and did not. A breath of air moved through the gate and stirred the tissue on the table so that, for an instant, the almost erased pencil marks trembled into the light before subsiding. Purbright stood a moment longer, his hat in his hand, and wondered, not with accusation yet, who in Brayne found it necessary to hum hymns no longer printed, and to pay for lettering that thanked the parish while sending the bill to its account. Then he put on his hat, and the thought, like a minor key refusing to brighten, took up a seat beside him and travelled discreetly into the afternoon. The church hall, having been built for purposes broader than anyone's appetite, had learnt how to look useful without being too encouraging. A black kettle laboured at one end among trays and apologetic cups. Chairs stood in 3 rows that had been persuaded not to squeak. A notice board watched with a patience that had often been mistaken for approval. Evening came on with the Anglican restraint it reserved for villages. A little late, a trifle chilly, and quite determined to be polite. Purbright assembled the parish property committee not so much by summoning as by declining to prevent it. People in Brayne were attracted to their names read aloud. Alderman Bligh arrived first, buttoned to his principles. Miss Hask followed in editorial black. Mr. Thrip came as one who had left a counter to look after itself, and Mrs. Boswell brought a shawl that preferred to be an argument. The vicar drifted in after his smile. Love positioned himself behind a kettle that had already memorized his face. Tea, which in the hall always arrived apologizing for its temperature, was poured. Purbright stood at the table with an aspect that declined to claim authority and therefore received it. "Thank you," he said. "We are here to celebrate a parish achievement." They looked at him as one looks at an usher who has misdelivered a program. "A fund," he continued, "once public, then absent, then redistributed by embarrassment. Corrections, applied piecemeal by persons who preferred dignity to confession, and accounts which have longed for daylight while being guarded from vulgarity. Mrs. Pargeter would have enjoyed our position. She liked tidy endings that did not spoil anyone's appetite." He opened the box file the vicar had set down with sacerdotal reluctance and placed beside it the narrow exercise book retrieved from Edith's handbag. Miss Hask's bound annual lay to hand, bookmark already in place. Papers have a way of choosing their own choreography when given a table. They arrange themselves now with the inevitability of minutes and proofs. The envelope discovered in Mrs. Pargeter's coffin, Purbright said, may be read as a last nudge. Whether placed by Edith's prior instruction or by someone who understood her method, it said only what arithmetic had been saying in private. Reopen the subscription fund. Not to rattle tins, to bring accounts into air. Bligh exhaled in the key that passes for equanimity among public men. "If there is a proposal, Inspector, I will be glad to lend it my support. We must not allow retrospection to interrupt service." "The proposal is merely this," Purbright said, "that we recognize what has already been achieved without ceremony. Anonymous restitutions have occurred. Paint has been applied where cash preferred not to appear. Promises have been paid in kind and then in pencil. We will not rehearse names. They have been rehearsed in bedrooms. We will, however, conclude the arithmetic like Christians, with modesty and in full." He turned the exercise book so that it faced the room. Its columns stood like candlesticks. "Here are the tallies Mrs. Pargeter kept when narrative became too busy. Some entries," he let the razored gaps exhibit themselves. have been removed by a careful hand, perhaps to spare persons who could be discouraged only by success. Here, he set down Miss Hask's prepared but unissued circular, is the notice we did not print, and here, from the archive, receipts, promises, and apologies. Thrip inspected the promissory note that had been cancelled in pencil. His complexion took on a shade that, on hymn days, might have passed for fervour. "I itemize again," he said, briskly penning in the margin as a man might time his pulse. "Preservative, at cost, 3 coats to North Style. Labour donated, plates polished, box lodged under counter an injudicious fortnight. Interest, 1 shilling, paid to conscience. Balance." He wrote the little word with satisfaction, like a tradesman fitting a final screw. "Nil." Mrs. Boswell looked away as if averting her gaze from public arithmetic might yet rescue romance. The vicar, who had tried in his drafts to invent mercy strong enough to carry sums, cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, "as one who has erred by wanting people to feel better than they were. Perhaps a small plaque, very small, at the lich gate. Not the names of men, which succeed in being wrong whether included or omitted, but an inscription acknowledging anonymous perseverance." "Perseverance," said Mrs. Boswell, "is a virtue that often hides a ledger." "Quite," said Purbright. "Virtue and ledgers become unbearable only when they seek applause. A discreet plaque, then. Miss Hask." "I can prepare a notice of 2 paragraphs," Miss Hask said. "One to say we are grateful, one to omit why. It will be brief and tactful and contain no hyphens that expect credit." Bligh had waited the proper interval in which other persons might bleed. He withdrew from his pocket a cheque-book whose carbon had practised humility. He wrote with his robust pen, the nib unafraid of guilt. The figure he produced reached comfortably beyond adequacy without attaining confession. He passed the cheque to the vicar with a small incline of the head that looked like a bow, performed by a man standing on his own reputation. "I cannot, of course, accept that anything untoward occurred," he said, "but where community sentiment has grown thirsty, one does not keep the well behind a hedge." The vicar took the cheque as men take sacraments when the bishop is watching. He placed it upon the box file as if the file might bless it. Thrip coughed a consent shaped like a nail. Mrs. Boswell allowed that a hymn in G would not misrepresent the occasion. Purbright waited for the room to release air. "We must also acknowledge a small courtesy the parish owes the parish," he said, and set the engraver's tissue upon the table. "Pelham and Bright's bill, addressed to the parish, paid, after a manner, by gratitude. Let us discharge it without gratitude, and see if the air improves." Bligh had the grace to smile. "Indeed," he said, "one cannot be thanked twice in a single sentence without corrupting grammar." "Then we are agreed," Purbright said. "The fund reopened only long enough to close. The plaque commissioned. The archive, such as it is, transferred to the safer prison of finished business. A notice printed that mentions no person, yet reminds everyone." They assented in the Brayne way, by not finding a reason to do anything else. Pens were lifted and put down like birds practicing migration. Minutes were proposed, seconded, and laid to rest. Tea remembered it had cooled. The bell on the table made, without assistance, a minute sound of contentment. The hall, once unoccupied by decision, instantly became convivial. Mr. Swithins appeared from nowhere with views about weather and timber moths. The church warden found his name and put it back where it belonged. Mrs. Boswell wrapped her shawl and her skepticism. Bligh shook hands as if the act relieved both parties of expenditure. Miss Hask slipped the circular back into her folder with a tenderness some people reserve for photographs. The doors at the far end opened upon a modest draught and Mrs. Joan Leeming, who carried in both hands an object that had not yet decided whether it wished to matter. She walked as those do who have been taught to offer something and not to be offended when it is refused. "I'm sorry," she said, before anyone had found a place for apology. It was in the sewing basket. The last one. I'd been looking for a thimble that was not there. This, she held out an envelope, addressed and stamped, was at the bottom. Addressed to you, Inspector. Stamped, but unposted. Aunt Edith had a view about posting. She believed a stamp was a way of thinking twice. Purbright received the envelope in the manner people take kittens, firmly and with an eye to claws. The handwriting was Edith's, sparing with curves, fond of margins. He opened it under the attention of people who had known themselves to be judged by less than a sentence. Inside lay a single sheet, folded once with a crease that had been taught to hold. There were no salutations, only one line. Numbers are the only apologies that last. No one had an opinion about that which could be said aloud. They rehearsed respect in silence. Then the room resumed its tasks. Cups to a tray, chairs to alignment, gratitude to those portions of the air that had earned it. "Inspector," said the vicar, emboldened by the cheque in his breast pocket and the absence of hyphens in his conscience, "you have given us, what shall I call it, closure." "Brayne dislikes closure," Purbright said. "It prefers tidy doors." He put Edith's line away with the circular and the ledger as if sending related children to bed. Then he looked up at the door. "Mr. Delves." The verger, who had the look of a man to whom doors reported, stepped in at once. He carried keys in a hand that never forgot to wipe itself after brass. His face did not change upon being noticed. Vergers are born, noticed, and spend a lifetime correcting for it. "The gate key," Purbright said. "May I borrow it?" Delves made a little ritual of detachment. He drew from his ring a stout iron key whose bow had the moral shape of an oval and whose bit had polished itself. Against work. It hung from a small tag, once white, now parish, secured by twine. The tag had been typed Lich Gate. The letters were those of a machine that had done its best more often than it wished. The E in gate wore a faint exhaustion, as if asked too frequently to stand at the end of words and take the weather. Between the lich and the gate, someone had inserted, in pencil later smudged into discretion, a tiny hyphen. "New tag?" Love asked, as if admiring the weight. "Last week," Delves said, "Miss Hask insisted upon uniformity of labels. She has set herself to our keys. It is a mercy. They had begun to call themselves different names depending on who asked." Purbright turned the key in his palm. Its shoulders held a recent brightness where oil had argued with rust. A thin scent, polish, the decent kind, rose from the tag. The little hyphen, almost apologetic, looked newly decisive. "Thank you," he said. "I shall return it before complaint can reach the boiler." "Very good, sir," said Delves, whose measure of time was the interval between arrangements and their outcomes. The committee, recognizing dismissal when it heard courtesy, dispersed. Bligh left with a face arranged to be thanked, and was. Thrip, itemization concluded, went to release his till from the squeak of conscience. Mrs. Boswell folded the manila envelope into a size that would fit exactly a grievance. Miss Hask lingered to look at the notice board as if it had finally admitted all it knew. Joan Leeming stood a moment longer than she meant to, and then, managing a smile one could place among Edith's tidier legacies, thanked Purbright for taking the envelope's burden out of her drawer. Outside, the evening had acknowledged its own account and settled it in blue. The lich gate kept its silhouette with the injured pride of a structure that had been spoken of too often. Purbright and Love walked toward it across a yard that believed in gravel. At the gate, Purbright tried the key experimentally. The lock accepted it with an ease that suggested recent acquaintance with oil. He drew the key out again and watched a faint crescent of brightness on the bow fail to dull in the air. "Shall we leave it open?" Love asked, polite to structures. "Not yet," Purbright said. "We will open it properly when the plaque is fitted and gratitude has been persuaded into the correct font." He slipped the key into his pocket beside Edith's sentence. The tag brushed his fingers, lych-gate, the tired E and the modest hyphen together doing their best to make two parts behave like one. Behind them, inside the hall, chairs resumed their exact distances. On the table, a damp circle from a cup became a temporary planet, and then, at last, nothing. Purbright looked once up at the dark wood and thought, in that quiet, undemonstrative way in which sound conclusions visit decent men, of labels and of what they are asked to dignify, acts that announce themselves and others that arrange to look like memory. He set off toward the lane with love and said nothing further. Somewhere behind the notice board glass, a draft of Miss Hask's brief notice must already be convening itself from habit and verbs. On the key's small tag, the smudged hyphen waited, undecided whether it had been added for spelling or for peace.